This is a world of magic with various different races. Rondel is the main city in this world. After the era of myths and swords, the city of Rondel is now said to be in the era of magic, and the magic of this place is as developed as any other. But in this world, the political system is still a feudal system of kings and queens. Even so, the current era of magic is called the Golden Age of Rondel. On December 29, 1999, in the Century of Magic, the world was turned upside down by the will of an archmage. He claimed to have left power, knowledge, and wealth hidden somewhere in the world. Those who wish may go and take this treasure. The mage was a pioneer who led Rondel into the golden age of this century of magic. Also being the Archduke of the Bring Up Empire, he was the Ninth Circle Mage Lord Manhwa Lucas. But that bright light that was left faded as quickly as it illuminated. Lucas sent them wishing for it, saying that any one of them could possess the destiny he left behind. After that, most of the world wanted to find that destiny, and countless rumors spread. The first of them says that Lucas's dungeon is in the land of dragons. Secondly, it is possible that his goods and knowledge are divided among the allied nations, or they say that his air fortress is located above the sea in the center of the world. Regardless of everything, everyone was committed to finding the destiny of Manuel Lucas. But rumors are things that pass from mouth to mouth. No one has ever found any clue. Soon 20 years pass and we see a boy looking at a system screen. He is sweating after all. He received the destiny of Manuel Lucas, smiling and happy to have achieved this destiny. In 2007, at Lawrence Castle, the butler asks if the castle boy is going to study. The little boy agrees and says he will return his books, and the old man says that if asked, he would have done it himself. Politely, the boy says it was not necessary, and the maids realize that the second son of Count Lawrence is really a good boy. This is our protagonist, and he is a reincarnated. Nothing special happened in the last days of his old life. He died in a truck accident while serving in the army, but when he opened his eyes, he woke up in the body of this boy named Adrian Lawrence. Now he has started living as the son of this Count family that owns a property. At first it was confusing, but now he can use his past experiences as a great advantage in this life, being fond of studying. A man praises the protagonist, making his father proud of his son's talent. Our hero does everything to please his father, but it seems that some people get irritated by this. But there is something disappointing for him. Rondel was more advanced than the Earth, and because of that, he had a lot of difficulty in learning. But he can only continue to strive to increase his value, and therefore must continue to act like a genius. But something happened. This life is not easy to go through just with effort. When our protagonist was 7 years old, he was poisoned. He survived by luck. Adrian knew whose fault it was, and a woman came to his side, frightening the boy with her murderous and angry aura. She is the official wife of our protagonist's father. Her name is Anna Lawrence, and it was she who tried to assassinate him. For this woman, the boy, being of humble lineage, does not deserve his father's attention. This infuriates our hero, who thinks the political system is very backward. But our protagonist wonders why his father does not reprimand her, and thinks something. His father is pretending not to know even though he knows, and so the boy decides to stop acting like a genius. A few years later, on May 1, 2019, our 20-year-old protagonist is now in a common convenience store. The employee talks, asking if he is a celebrity, but the girl tells him to be quiet. She explains that he is a noble lord of this area. The employee remarks that he doesn't seem to dress like a noble, but our protagonist calls the attendant. He says he hasn't found any Chronicles point cards, and the attendant says they are sold at the cashier, then asking how many he wants. Gently, our protagonist says he wants them all. Both thank him for shopping with them as our hero leaves the store. The employee is scolded by the attendant for not knowing how to treat a noble. She says she was quite scared when he came in person the first time. The rookie asks if he comes often, and the attendant confirms that he does. He is also a big fan of games, according to the attendant, since he spent 5 million on game cards, which would be 5 million in Korean won. Then a guard calls our protagonist, saying that young Master Cedric is visiting his residence, which annoys Adrian. Our protagonist's beautiful mother calls him. He asks about his brother, while his mother is worried. Cedric, the protagonist's brother, yells at him for not using a vehicle on his property, which irritates the protagonist and scares his mother. He yells at the protagonist for not thinking about the family's reputation, and Adrian thinks that he wouldn't even be able to take care of himself if he weren't a noble. Our protagonist doesn't want to prolong the fight and then says he was thoughtless, saying he will pay attention next time, calming the black-haired one a bit. He says, laughing, that he doesn't need to be proud, since he's a half-breed. But our hero asks what brings him there. His foolish brother says that their father plans to make him take over a business, the Far's distribution company, and says that our hero must have heard, so our protagonist understands. He remembers that noble families are combinations of conglomerates, which consequently makes them have various businesses, and the Far's company makes money from mining and is one of the Lawrence family's businesses. The boy thinks he is quite greedy and incompetent. He says he understands and refuses to interfere in the matter. Cedric smiles, saying he expected this, and our protagonist asks him to leave, if that's all, showing that he spent a lot of money to play and making his brother laugh out loud. Passing by him with a threatening look, saying that he should just do that. His mother is worried, but Adrian smiles, saying that's what he's going to do, mentioning to her that it's better not to get involved. Our protagonist says he's going to play and should not be disturbed unless it's urgent, and thinks that after the attempt to be poisoned, he abandoned his image of a genius and isolated himself, imagining that his father had no interest in the son he had with a concubine, so he became indifferent. Thanks to that, he never again entered situations that put his life in danger and erased his presence for 10 years while receiving insults from people. After graduating, he left the castle with his mother. People said it was a side effect of the poison, and now he is just a freeloader. Our hero thinks that all the servants are under the influence of the official wife, so he can't even open his mouth. Our protagonist is silent for a moment. He arrives in his room seeing his virtual glasses. Walking slowly to his desk, picking up his glasses silently, and putting them on, he thinks about how they say he's focused on games to escape reality, smiling, saying there's no chance of that being true. The system tells him that he has completed the first phase of the mission of destiny, first starting to create his character based on his real-life body. The boy says that if you want to monitor someone, you must also do it in the virtual world. The system informs him that the abilities of the online game Chronicle are reflected in reality. 10 years ago, our protagonist was studying and researching Manhwa Lucas when he discovered something. The crest of the Lucas family is the word Y, which impressed the little boy, being impressed and wondering if the mage is also like him. But it's not good to make such conclusions since it could be a coincidence. However, it became impossible for Lucas not to be from Earth. The last words of Archduke Lucas were about wanting to walk on the beach in California with Mary one last time. His butler did not understand the meaning of those words, but the words of this man cannot be ignored, and therefore he recorded them on paper, making the boy realize that it was not coincidence. Indeed, the Archmage of Rondel was from Earth like our protagonist. Researching more about Lucas, he found things like folder projects and virtual glasses, and then, using his knowledge from Earth, he sought the destiny he left behind. After so much time, he found it, happy to lay his hands on the destiny. In the game, our hero took a direct hit on the arm, saying it was as he thought, facing a goblin that threw the blade that wounded him. He says the pain is real, and after he took the destiny, the true suffering began, wondering if he can fight without fear. Lucas's destiny was kept in the least expected place, which was online in a virtual world. Our protagonist thinks that even in a virtual world created based on reality, it will still be a game, and therefore he should not be able to feel pain because it is filtered. Still, he feels pain in real life, having difficulty every time he fights. Now he has synchronized the game with real life while the goblin goes into attack mode, charging our protagonist, who dodges the blow with some difficulty while preparing his blade, landing a critical hit on the goblin. Thus, leveling up to 10 and now being able to choose his class and also completing the first stage of the mission of destiny, ending up being moved to a secret space by the main god Ariel, starting his character and synchronizing with his real body, thus also being able to synchronize the abilities of Chronicle Online with reality. Thus, a door appears behind the protagonist. The system asks if he would like to go to the second floor of Manuel Lucas's magical tower, then Adrian agrees. Entering a library with a treasure chest, he thinks it is different from the first place, seeing the shelves and the treasure chest. Receiving about 5 billion loot, making our protagonist say that this seems like a real reward. It's a shame he still can't get all that money. A magic circle was created on his real and virtual body. Thus, Adrian says that this is the true value of destiny, and the system warns him not to leave the game. Our protagonist thinks he has never felt the presence of mana in real life. With the creation of the magic circle being successful, he can now feel the circulation of mana in his chest. Now having one circle created, he wonders if he will be able to learn any combat technique from these books. The system opens a window in front of him as soon as he touches a book, impressing him, asking if he would like to absorb the materials from the books, which makes him think it is convenient and expected of the best mage of humanity. After a while, he feels nauseous, feeling a huge headache. He thinks it's good to learn the skills and spells just by touching the books, but the process is painful. But now he holds the last book, which is about hiding the magic circle. The system questions if he would like to acquire this ability, and our protagonist thinks that this particular one is very precious, so he agrees to acquire it. Feeling a shock and pain in his mind, giving a laugh and falling to the side, while thinking that he didn't have much hope in the face of destiny. Lying on the floor, he can barely move and thinks he just wanted to live peacefully with his mother, but he will do everything to achieve it. Another day in the mansion's training hall, a night guard named Vice praises the protagonist's stamina. The boy says it's nothing, while the blonde hands him a handkerchief, saying he was surprised that he wanted to train in fencing. But our white-haired boy says his body feels heavier these days, and thinks that training in real life will help him in the game. Inside the game, he feels the limit of his low stamina because his character is synchronized with real life. Thinking that he can feel his mana circle and his stamina is gradually improving, he thinks that the stats also have an effect in real life. That is, he can use the game's abilities in real life. Grateful for being able to hide his mana circle with the hiding ability he got in Lucas's tower. The knight asks if something good happened, and our protagonist realizes that he was looking very happy, giving an excuse that he just got a good item in a game. The people around the two speak ill of him, calling him a game addict and aberration. Vice gets angry, but our protagonist tells him not to worry about them. Our hero is grateful for Vice pretending to be angry, but he needs to avoid the pathetic looks of Anna and his half-brother, and therefore being ignored is best for him. Returning to the game, he confirmed that the stats reflect in real life. Now he needs to do something that will give him money and more abilities. It's precisely spending his money in the game. Using his money, he buys various things like increased spend blessings. He says he should have used the money before, but he could only use the store from level 10. The main event of the day for our protagonist is precisely summoning a supporter. Thinking that with his low stamina, it will be better to have support to evolve, decides he will play in a team, which will make it not a waste of money. With the money and hope, he will try to get the highest class warrior as a tank, making 10 summons but not just getting low-level supports. He feels disappointed, thinking that it's really hard to win something good in these gacha games, and he has already spent over 30 million won and got nothing. But something comes that impresses him. Arcia, the Celestial Steel, leaves our protagonist impressed, thinking she must be a character that hasn't been discovered. Thinking that with level 250, she must be one of the best among the unique tier. He is happy to get good support and chooses to register her. The system informs him, saying that he will not be able to make changes to the support and asks if he is sure about this. Our protagonist is confused, wondering if he can't freely replace his support, but the system informs him that she is an exception. He thinks that this is a limitation imposed by the system itself, but she must be the best support for a mage like him. So he says he is sure. The system begins to register his support. Our protagonist thinks that this effect is different. His support begins to be summoned in front of him. Standing in front of him is a beautiful girl in armor. Our protagonist finds her beautiful, but she seems like an emotionless golem. He thinks that doesn't matter and calls her to go level up. We see her managing to block any attack with her huge shield. Adrian stays behind her, attacking with magic missile spells, being impressed when he sees her stats. Realizing he has reached level 20 with ease, and all thanks to the help of his tank. He thinks it will be difficult to practice magic in real life, and the system tells him to turn off and rest since he has already played for 15 hours. Then he logs out of the game, sitting down and stretching while thinking about taking a nap, then go into the training room. But suddenly he notices someone else in the room with him, getting scared that Arcia is out of the game. Adrian faces the girl from the game who is now in his room and then asks who she is. Arcia responds that she is the support of her master, and our protagonist says that's not what he's asking. Taking her chin, he says he wants to know how she got out of the game. She understands that his curiosity is about how her presence is being maintained in reality. Our protagonist agrees, thinking that she seems to know the difference between reality and the game. She explains that she is an android homunculus that was created by Manhwa Lucas, based on the characteristics of Arcia the Celestial Steel. Adrian asks if she is like a legacy of Mage Lucas, and the girl agrees. Embarrassed, our protagonist thinks he would have chosen the most versatile support and asks if her stats are the same as in the game. She confirms that she will recover her restricted stats when the protagonist's level increases, but at the current moment she has strength comparable to a Grandmaster. This information scares the boy. Our protagonist thinks that a Grandmaster has the level of an 8th Circle Mage, being one of the strongest on the continent. He thinks about how Manuel Lucas created such a monster, but it's good to have a companion who only follows his orders. The problem is hiding. She then asks where she was before, and she says she was in a magical warehouse. But if she wants to go back, she will have to walk. Our protagonist asks her to try to hide her mana. She succeeds, and the boy thinks that now she will not be discovered by the knights. In a relaxed manner, the boy thinks he has no choice, telling the girl that his reputation is already one of the worst. In the mansion, people talk about rumors. Rumors about Adrian bringing a woman to the mansion, and everyone there thinks he is the most shameless person in the world. But the protagonist's mother is super happy, asking when he will get married. He remembers the scene while the system alerts him that he has reached level 30. Looking at the system, he ends up thinking that this way no one will suspect Arcia. Adrian asks Arcia what happens to her body in the real world while she is in the game. She explains that she goes into a rest mode, however, she will continue to monitor her master. Our protagonist asks if she will notify him if something happens outside, and she confirms. The two look at a black fog. The orc warrior can't appears in front of them, and that is the second stage of the mission of destiny. Calling our protagonist human, the orc explains that it will be special if he kills him. A system notification informs him that he will not be able to use any item on this mission. Confident, he calls for Arcia, who understands the order. The orc advances screaming while Arcia gets her shield ready. Hitting the blow, the shield remains intact, throwing the monster back with the force of its own blow. He is startled to see a light. Our protagonist charges a magic to launch directly at the monster, firing a magic missile at his eye, hitting a critical. Our protagonist thinks that his magic missiles are stronger because of his body and his equipment. Distracted while thinking, a blow comes directly from his left, but Arcia blocks the blow with her shield. Adrian, relieved, thinks that this is madness. He looks at the monster thinking that he was well affected by the critical blow, saying that he is strangely strong. Thinking that without Arcia he would have died in just one blow. Being nervous, he thinks that he has already died once before. Then he uses a digging spell, making a hole in the ground and unbalancing the orc. With the monster down, our protagonist cannot let his fear get in the way, and he orders Arcia to prevent him from getting up while he attacks. The orc gradually loses his HP with the attacks. After a while, he gets up with 50 HP. Adrian admits that he is very persistent, deeply irritating the orc, charging our protagonist with anger, while our hero says that he should have lowered his sword, charging a magic towards the orc, and firing a last magic missile that defeats him. The system informs him that he has completed the second stage of the Mission of Destiny and unlocked the third floor of Manuel Lucas's magical tower. In the office of Viscount Lawrence at night, the protagonist's father seems thoughtful, looking out the window. A woman asks what he is thinking. Rayford Lawrence, the father of our hero, stares at the woman. She approaches, wondering why he is alone at night, then questioning if he is thoughtful because of the protagonist's actions. The old man calls her by the name of Anna. She is his first wife. Then he shows her a letter. The wife reads the paper about the summons for a possible war, which leaves Anna frightened. She asks if he plans to send Cedric to war, and the man remains silent. Smiling, she says to send our protagonist in his place. The old man asks her if after isolating him, she still wishes him to be useful to her. The woman says that was the protagonist's choice, and that he has only been taking advantage of the rights of nobility. Rayford says she is mistaken about him, and she asks what he means. The blonde-haired man remains silent, and says that her son will succeed the territory, and he will not cause trouble for her or her stepfather. She just has to follow his decisions. This leaves Anna silent, but with a face of anger and hatred. He will send Adrian to war, and when he returns, he will no longer be a member of the family and hopes that he and his mother will not be in danger in the future, saying that should be enough for her, telling her to stop worrying and let Adrian be free. The knight praises that the protagonist's physical strength has improved a lot in recent days. Our protagonist thinks that he only became strong because he reached level 30 in the game and completed the second stage of the Mission of Destiny. He earned a lot of money and a second mana circle as a reward, in addition to gaining a subspace, which is like an inventory in real life. Thinking that with his effort, he can be a mage with the physical abilities of a knight and can become someone even more incredible than the Archmage Lucas. He says he needs to stop to rest until someone calls him, saying that he was summoned to go to the castle. A few days later, our hero arrived at Lawrence Castle. Our protagonist was wondering why he was called, but his brother starts yelling, asking why our hero is going to represent the family on the battlefield. The old man explains that Cedric is the heir to the family and cannot go to the battlefield. Our protagonist's mother asks if Adrian is not as important as Cedric. Ray says there is a difference in value between him and the family heir. Our protagonist starts to get irritated with his father's words, but thinks it's not so bad for him, thinking that he is just a substitute for the heir and no one will mess with him. But as soon as he returns, he will be able to get rid of Anna's surveillance. Confident, he says he will participate in the war representing the Lawrence family. The old man thanks our protagonist, which makes Cedric angry. He says he will accept the father's decision and tells him not to defame the family, and the boy thinks he is ungrateful and immature. Our protagonist says he will do his best, but his father calls him, asking if they can talk. Outside, the two walk alone while he imagines it is something very particular. Adrian asks his father what he wants to talk about, and his father says he will relocate him and his mother to the king's land. This is the reward for going in Cedric's place, and so our protagonist will be able to do whatever he wants. Adrian thinks that Anna allowed this even though she hates him so much and therefore he should not fully trust his father. He says he will think about it. The father says he understands that he does not trust him, and our protagonist says he just needs to come back alive from the battle to think about it. Rayford sighs, remembering something, and hands something to Adrian, who asks what it is that was handed to him. The father explains that these are shield artifacts, and that they will be useful to him in the war, making our protagonist realize that they are extremely valuable artifacts. Adrian thanks him, and his father says he needs to be conscious to survive. He looks back, realizing that his stepmother and brother are watching them, noticing an aura of anger and hatred coming from the two. Our protagonist thinks it would be obvious for the two to watch. His father tells him not to worry about his mother. The boy thinks that his father has disappointed him several times, but now that he is surrounded by enemies, he can only trust him. Confident, he says he will go to war, impressing the patriarch by saying that he will trust him this time. Later, his father feels something. A sudden pain intensifies in his head. Then he uses a ring with an ability to lessen the pain, getting up with difficulty, thinking that Adrian was really just pretending after the poison incident. Elsewhere, someone cries. The protagonist's mother is crying while he tries to reassure her. She is afraid they will try to hurt him after the battle. Adrian says that would be good to have more crimes in their names. His mother is confused, saying someone might hear the conversation, but our protagonist says that Arcia is guarding the door, saying he is no longer hurting himself as before, and says that soon everything will end, so he asks her to wait a little longer. 2 days later, an employee is confused with the protagonist, asking who the girl is. Our protagonist says her name is Arcia. The employee says he heard about the two's relationship, but thinks it's not a good idea to bring a mistress to a battlefield. In the conference room, the protagonist says to think of her as his secretary. He thinks that Arshia is his greatest defense and therefore he cannot leave her behind, but he still needs to improve his survival tactics. Spending 200 million in the game, he completed the 3rd level of the Lucky Encounter, and now he is about to enter the 4th level. The rewards of the 3rd level cost 100 billion each and even got healing potions and some elixirs. Thinking that these rewards in his inventory are perfect for the present situation, the boy says you will rest, and if something happens, you should send him a message, leaving the others confused. And our protagonist says he will play a little, asking if there is any problem. A redhead in the background says the rumors were true. Our protagonist thinks he is a vanguard. Vanguards are a special force equipped with special equipment and are the most important soldiers to assess the military strength of a nation. Dalton says he will be seen as an incompetent commander if he goes to play and says he has a bad reputation and now is only worsening it with the girl in the game. Provoking, he says the girl is pretty, but suddenly he is interrupted by someone. In a threatening manner, he tells him to watch his words. Dalton is afraid of the man's words. Billiam, the vice leader of the Knights, apologizes for his subordinate and understands he wants to kill time during the trip. Our protagonist thinks that his expression does not seem like someone who wants to apologize. Billiam says he doesn't need to worry about the opinion of the subordinate, and Adrian is sure he doesn't like him either, but he doesn't care about that. Leaving the atmosphere heavy, he says to send a message when he arrives. In the game, a potion called Salamander Tears flies towards a lizard, causing an explosion on the monster that defeats it. Our protagonist thinks it's expensive, but causing 3,000 damage is very acceptable. Soon the system informs him that he has reached level 80. The main god Ariel takes him to his secret room. Adrian thinks he finally reached the 4th level mission. The Demolit calls them prey, and our protagonist thinks he needs to finish this quickly. Our protagonist thinks about his enemy. According to him, liches are hard to kill, but this particular one seems slow. The lich casts a stone curse spell on Arshia. Soon after, he uses an ice spear spell towards the protagonist. Adrian is startled by the monster attacking earlier than expected. Arshia can't help him, so he has the only option to dodge and ends up having his shoulder hit. He screams in pain, and the lich, laughing, says he can hear the protagonist's bones and flesh being crushed. On the ground, he trembles, unable to think well because of the pain, also thinking that his laugh is annoying. He has heard that laugh somewhere, and our protagonist sees his brother in that lich, which makes Adrian very angry. Laughing, the lich raises his wand and tells him to stay on the ground. Launching a fireball towards the protagonist, who dodges and advances along with his support, approaching and confusing the skeleton. Adrian then uses a healing spell right in the lich's face that screams in agony. He tells Arshia not to give him space to cast another spell, and she confirms. Then it is explained that the best way to face a lich without a priest is to enchant their equipment with a holy attribute. The lich screams as the two beat him with the holy element. Crying, the lich asks how he can cause physical damage with the wand. Then he uses a fire wall spell and boasts about getting distance with it. Like a demon, our protagonist crosses the flames in front of the lich. The lich curses him for crossing the fire wall. But with hatred, our hero strikes the skull and tells this monster similar to Cedric to die. Then the system informs him that he has completed the 4th stage of the Lucky Encounter. In pain, our protagonist puts his hand on his chest. Arshia runs towards the protagonist. He thinks the adrenaline is over and now he feels all the pain of the fight. She takes a potion from the protagonist's inventory and gives it to him carefully. Healing, he is impressed that she can open his inventory and thinks she is really special. Then he thanks her, saying he is much better. The 5th floor of the tower was unlocked and the system teleports the two to the 5th floor. The protagonist runs towards the chest. Excited, he opens the chest, wondering about the reward that was 500 billion won. But he notices something more inside the chest. He receives round glasses and says it's impossible to be just mere normal glasses. Then he asks for a detailed description and sees that it is glasses with observation, clairvoyance, and night vision in addition to various other vision abilities. Impressed that someone as suspicious as him would receive such a useful item, the system then creates his 4th circle. Then they arrive at the camp. People are impressed that the 2nd son of the Lawrence family was chosen to come. The elders converse that they expected Cedric, while saying that the protagonist turned into an idiot after ingesting poison. Our protagonist says he is the boy who took the poison, and the two completely friendly say he doesn't look like an idiot. The two are counts and are head and assistants of this headquarters, and the white-haired boy says it is a pleasure to meet them. Viscount Evans observes that the protagonist's troops are composed of 5 vanguards and 50 knights, and our protagonist confirms. But the Viscount emphasizes that this war does not need knights, only vanguards, and our hero thinks they treat the armed elite as objects. Vanguards can only be controlled by 7th circle mages, and unfortunately, our protagonist agrees with him. Adrian remembers that the Vanguard was created by Lucas, and the Viscount says that the protagonist's army was organized as the 2nd Brigade and tells him to go receive his report with Count Otis. Our protagonist agrees, understanding. Then he explains to his group that the army was organized as the 2nd Independent Brigade. The boy says to continue and keeps in his mind a request that Count Otis be someone good. After a week, our hero is in the game thinking that Commander Otis is the best. The best type of superior for our protagonist is precisely an absent one, and Count Otis is traveling from one side to the other with transports until the war starts. He thinks he can play all day with that, but suddenly Arcia calls the protagonist, saying that someone entered the room, leaving him with a look of hatred and rage. Closing the game and seeing Arcia holding someone, Dalton asks how a woman has so much strength. Our protagonist picks up his glasses, wondering why he came there. Observing Dalton's status, he realizes that he is excited. The protagonist asks for an explanation for him being there, and Dalton says he is concerned about his health. And when he was going to blame the girl, the boy kicks him in the shin. He bends down in pain, and our protagonist says he should have sent a message, and Arcia is always protecting him. Adrian says he entered the commander's room of the brigade without permission and asks if he wanted to kill him. The man screams with anger and fear, saying that he is a vanguard. Then he receives another kick from the boy, who says he needs to be convinced. Then he asks Arcia what happened, and she replies that he tried to separate her from him. Dalton is embarrassed, while the protagonist asks if he tried to take her to another place, and she confirms. Dalton yells at the protagonist for trying to incriminate him and tells him to believe in his vanguard instead of a tramp like that girl. He realizes that 3 more soldiers followed him to sea, and Arcia hands a knife to Adrian, who says that this is a mutiny, and therefore he deserves to receive a punishment. Placing the knife on his abdomen, he tells Dalton to step forward to receive his punishment. The soldiers and Dalton mock the protagonist's face, who says he doesn't need to calm down. Now is the time for him to show his true face and tells Dalton to come up. Elsewhere, someone screams that the commander is calling Vice Leader Billiam, leaving him confused. He explains that the brigade commander gave the order of execution for Dalton, and they need to go there now. Billiam thinks this is unexpected. Arriving at the place, Billiam holds a knife that was thrown in his direction, realizing that it has a little blood on it. The protagonist says he should have come faster, and he almost killed Dalton. Billiam coldly stares at Dalton on the ground, writhing in pain. Then he asks what the context of the situation is. Mockingly, our protagonist says that knights should not harass women, which makes the old man extremely tense, screaming and asking what they did. Billiam bows, saying it was his fault, and asks for forgiveness. He suspends Dalton and asks to confiscate his armor and arrest him. The other 3 will also spend time in prison for insubordination and complicity. Adrian says he is in command and is not there to take care of children, giving a pat on the shoulder of Billiam and saying that this is not the county. Leaving, he says he will stay in the room next door as this one is stinking of blood. Dalton realizes that he finally showed who he really is and gives a light and satisfied smile, thinking that someone interesting appeared there. Back in the game, Arcia and Adrian are in a fight. She blocks an attack from the opponent while our protagonist attacks using magic. The boy thinks that the enemy tries to hit his weak points. His enemy is a fallen knight named Zenit and must kill him to fulfill the lucky encounter level 5. Zenit carries a purple aura on his sword. Preparing the attack, he tells our protagonist to die. The blow goes towards his mech. With dexterity, Adrian dodges the attack. Zenit is astonished and suddenly something flies in his direction. Arcia hits a charge in Zenit's face. Our protagonist prepares a spell. The old man lets out a laugh. He now understands that he is just a step for the protagonist. He notifies the system that the mission was completed and the 6th floor of the tower was unlocked. Our protagonist receives 2 trillion loots, which makes him happy, but he is surprised to see another notification and several Istro equipment, and our protagonist thinks that he will only be able to use the cloak and the scepter, as the rest will go to Arcia. Before doing anything, he stops when Arcia informs him of an intruder and asks for forgiveness for intruding. Our protagonist asks what happened, and the butler says he felt a powerful aura. The boy explains that he was checking some artifacts and he should not worry. Asking for permission, the butler says goodbye and leaves the room. Our protagonist takes the sword out of his inventory and confirms that this sword is the type of weapon that an elite vanguard would use, in addition to being able to make a normal person match a vanguard for 15 seconds. Adrian thinks that the weapons used by the vanguards amplify the aura, since it is difficult to store the aura, and wonders what the ability of the mage equipment is, being surprised that the 2 also have the ability to store aura. Our boy understands the reason why everyone wants Lucas's destiny. Elsewhere, it has been 2 weeks since he was appointed to be commander. Our protagonist says he doesn't need an escort, and everyone there confirms. Adrian thinks that everyone will give their lives for the country, but still they are just sitting waiting. Adrian noticed that after the Dalton incident, everyone has been avoiding and respecting him, but the most peculiar person is Billiam, who looks at him in a very friendly way. The boy thinks this is good since he can now play in peace. But looking at Arcia, he notices something, becoming confused to see her status as happy. He thinks the girl is like a puppy that gets happy when going out for a walk. On the outside, she's a homunculus, which makes our protagonist find it hard to believe she can have emotions, but he is starting to understand her. With the brightness, he covers his eyes, thinking that this place is cool. Taking another look at her, He realizes that she is very happy, and this makes him laugh, leaving Arshia confused. Later, he tells them to go out more often, and Arshia agrees. A soldier arrives in front of the protagonist embarrassed, and he asks what the problem is. The blonde asks if they can go out for a drink sometime. Our protagonist notices his status as embarrassed and uncomfortable, understanding this situation when he sees the boys laughing in the background. He then asks if the boys in the back sent him to do this. The boy says no, and the protagonist thinks he has a reason, but he is not interested, so he walks away. But he stops halfway and asks why he decided to be a knight. The soldier apologizes, assuring that it will not happen again, and our protagonist observes him, thinking that he is the first person after the homunculus who has more than 2 high talents. He has talent to be a mage, so why is he being mocked by the other knights? Our protagonist thinks it's not his problem and apologizes, turning away. Leaving, he says it would be better if he were a mage instead of a soldier, which surprises the boy. Adrian scolds the other soldiers as he leaves. In the room, he thinks it's a waste. The boy doesn't want to get involved to avoid trouble, but he thinks that Soldier Lopes is unique. Even without physical combat power, he would do well if he combined magic with Vanguard equipment. His chances are good, according to our protagonist. It would be wonderful if he had him under his command. The problem is getting Count Otis to hand over Lopes to him, and he thinks bribery would be a good option. Standing up, he thinks he needs to build his influence, especially now that Adrian is free, so he decides, saying that both will be busy for a while. The boy from before marches down the camp corridor. He remembers what Adrian told him earlier, thinking that he is different from the other nobles. Arriving at Commander Otis's room, he introduces himself to enter. In his mind, he imagines that Adrian is different from the rumors and that is kind of scary, so he enters the commander's room. The commander greets him and welcomes him. But Lopez is confused to see our protagonist there. He wonders why he called him, and the chubby one introduces Adrian as the representative of the Lawrence family. From now on, Mr. Lawrence will be the Lord of Lopes, and this makes the blonde boy confused. In the protagonist's past life, China lost to Korea in the World Cup. A citizen asked how they didn't find 11 good players among China's population of 1 billion people. And the answer is because the Chinese Messi and CR7 are somewhere taking care of plants on a farm. Adrian, with this in mind, knows that potential doesn't matter if it's not properly explored. He is surprised that in this place there are so many people following the wrong paths. A third-class knight, Alan Lopes, Barbara Anderson, a commoner who is a manual laborer. Eric Jones is one of the only soldiers capable of playing an instrument. A boy who tried to sell hentai to the soldiers. His name is Nicholas Brown, and a maid named Linda Noah. Our protagonist thinks that each of them is incredible, but they never have the chance to shine, and the girl calls our protagonist. She asks why she is there since her mage test was negative, and Adrian says the test was wrong. Embarrassed, she understands, and our hero thinks it's better to have been worth every penny of the $500,000 he spent on her. The boy knows that none of them know the real reason for being there, and the tall man orders no one to question, and says to believe in the protagonist. Our boy thinks this guy has a great talent for aura. Our protagonist knows that he would die of hunger and exhaustion, but putting that aside, he has confidence in the protagonist, so the boy tells them to change clothes, telling them not to worry because they are 100 kilometers from the front, so they can choose any clothes from this noble area. He smiles, thinking that everyone is embarrassed for never having set foot in such a place. One of the men says he has already chosen. Our protagonist says it looked good on him and he thanks. The boy thinks he has a high talent in politics. He tells the others that the price doesn't matter, so they can choose the best for themselves. Talent doesn't matter at all if you don't train it. They will train outside the base and be educated to fit into the environment. All the boys are impressed to see their new home. Our protagonist confirms that this is the house where they will spend most of their time. The boy has already prepared the employees, so they must focus on their studies, in addition to making this month's payment to them of $20 million, and tells them not to forget the contract. The boys stand at attention and say they will do their best. Our protagonist says that their payment will only increase if they prove their worth, but that won't appear overnight. Finally, he looks at the blonde and smiles, asking not to disappoint him. Everyone affirms and agrees. Our protagonist likes their spirit, and his schedule is to study and train for 16 hours every day. There are all the best talents that our hero has found. In the future, they will be the elite that he handpicked. This will be a great investment for a bright future that our protagonist aims for. Walking through the city streets, our protagonist thinks he needs to prepare to confront his brother and perhaps even his stepmother, but he must think about his mother's safety as well. Before that, he looks at someone who is following him. Arshia grabs the person by the neck and throws them against the wall, and our hero says good morning to the man. In recent days, our protagonist has not been able to relax, worried about the safety of others, in addition to having seen several spies every day. He thinks that Cedric is only sending 2 spies to take turns and tells the man to spare his words. With a knife in hand, our boy says there's only one way to make him useful, which leaves the man desperate. Adrian says that stupidity is a flaw in a spy. Arshia throws him to the ground, and our protagonist asks how much he values his life, saying that everything will be fine if he does what is asked, and the man feels a strong aura, realizing that the girl is an aura specialist. The man says he knows nothing and thinks he doesn't want to die there in that place. Sometime later, our protagonist guesses that he received help from the agent who was inside the portal, and the man trembles in fear, wondering how he knows this. He thinks about telling lies. However, our protagonist already knows everything about him and the other spy, but with this he can get some help from him. Adrian knows that he is only following his brother's orders. After all, he felt that the man did not want to spy on him. Frightened, the man looks at Arcia and asks if he is really going to go against his brother, and our protagonist is happy to see that he fell into his trap. Before refusing, our protagonist places the knife right in front of his face. Scaring the man, he says he knows he is not afraid of death, but still wants to live. Fortunately, he asks what the man thinks about working for him, and the spy trembles in fear. Our hero, while sticking the knife into his forehead, says he prides himself on being someone merciful and just wants him to make some false reports. The boy asks if he understood, and the man agrees. In the office of the protagonist's brother, he yells, asking how his other spy was caught. He says he was caught trying to enter the protagonist's room. He gets irritated, thinking that this happened for having ignored his father, saying not to send spies, and even has been ridiculed for not being chosen to go to the army. Cedric says he has no other choice and therefore must continue to keep an eye on the protagonist and report everything. Agreeing, the spy says he will contact him later. Now that Adrian has solved the spy problem, everything will go well. The others are also progressing, and he even recruited another 20 talented people, in addition to Eric and Elysia proving to be capable of leading the school. Everyone is giving their best, and our protagonist is not behind and has already reached level 159. He is happy that he is one level away from becoming a 6th circle mage. But the system notifies him of something that surprises him. An emergency is requesting the protagonist's presence. Leaving the room, he asks for a report. The servant says that enemy combat ships have been detected entering their airspace. Everyone has been ordered to be alert. The war is about to start. In the meeting room, it is informed that the Croizon Empire's army has moved. Count Otis informs that the troops boarded the Leviathan train so that they can enter combat at any moment. Also, spatial interference began at the Empire's border, so using teleport means putting oneself in danger of death. In addition, all communication roads between the troops have been cut, so they must use only radio to communicate. And he says that the protagonist is no exception and must ensure to have a radio in his room, but our protagonist thinks that this will not make him stop playing. The Count yells for everyone to be prepared, as this is a war and everyone agrees, understanding. Our protagonist gets serious, thinking that the war has finally started. Thus, inside the game, he reaches level 160 and wonders if he will reach the 6th circle now. Our protagonist ignored any warning not to play and says it was worth it. He then receives a loot of 10 trillion as a reward, but a glow in the room catches his attention. Then he receives a sub-support, which is a supersonic black eagle. He thinks that sub-supports should not exist, and this eagle is commonly an archer's support, but probably he will get more information in real life, and so he exits the game. Standing up, he asks where she is and thinks she must be outside. On the aircraft, Adrian thought the eagle would appear like Arcia, but that would cause chaos, and suddenly the girl notices something, pointing to the sky and saying there she is. All the soldiers are on alert and ask the commander to divert, but the huge bird throws everyone away with the breeze of its wings, and stares at the protagonist seriously, leaving him impressed. Bowing her head in front of the protagonist, Adrian signals for the soldiers not to interfere. He observes the eagle and realizes that she only has one ability, which is shared vision. Petting the eagle's head, he thinks if the condition for her to gain more abilities must be to carry out missions. He then thinks that the shared vision ability will be very useful, and our protagonist is startled when one of the soldiers calls him. Asking what it is, Adrian focused so much on the eagle that he didn't even notice the people gathering. Clearing his throat, he thinks he doesn't have much to do. Extending his hand, he asks if the eagle wants to stay by his side. The eagle appreciates the caress of the protagonist's hand in a sign of confirmation, and the two get cuddly. The soldiers wonder why the eagle doesn't attack him and find it novel to see the two cuddling. Our protagonist is embarrassed, wondering why he is doing this. Elsewhere, the attacks have already begun. After the war began, it spread throughout the entire western border. With that, the protagonist's brigade also entered combat, and with the internet turned off, our protagonist cannot enter the game. Someone informs the protagonist that the vanguard platoon of the Empire is getting closer and closer. The boy calmly tells them to relax and retreat to the initial formation and tell Billiam to prepare the vanguards. Adrian is calm because he had experiences in the game and therefore thinks he will not die so easily. Noticing that he is being watched, he asks when it was, and the man turns around saying it was nothing. Our protagonist notices something, seeing that the enemy vanguards are going to attack now. Then he shouts for the 2nd Battalion to activate the energy shield. Thus, the shield was activated, and an attack was launched towards the ship, exploding on the ship's shield, making it tremble. The boy smiles, thinking that this attack was too strong to be a test. Asking about the situation, it is said that the shield of the 2nd Battalion is gone, and they need 90 seconds to recover. Our protagonist thinks that a single vanguard was already able to destroy the energy shield. Arcia asks if he is okay, and he confirms, thinking that at least he has an 8th Circle Grandmaster with him. One of the team members says they survived thanks to him, and the protagonist says he is very lucky. The old man says he is humble. Seeing the situation, he starts to think. Their strength is not so different. The problem is the fortress they have, saying that the Empire has 2 sky fortresses that are a little smaller than theirs, but were produced for a mass attack. The old man says this is the first time they use these fortresses, and our protagonist sees that there are vanguards on the ground and in the fortresses. At the bottom, there is a stalemate, and their chances are right there. Our protagonist realizes that this battle is a mess, but he notices that in the fortress, there is a weapon separation that leaves him scared and apprehensive. Then, one of the rings of the fortress falls, leaving the soldiers confused. While they attack, they think that now it is 1 against 1, laughing and saying it's funny while imagining that something of theirs was broken. But our protagonist realizes that the ship is entering a state of magical power overload, and he shouts for everyone to send a message to the fortress. They are going to suffer a kamikaze attack. The ship flies towards the other, causing a huge explosion. In the sky fortress, everyone is in despair and requests immediate evacuation. The soldiers start using anti-aircraft bullets and scream to use everything they have. But Adrian realizes that it will not work and it will break. Then he uses one of the artifacts given by his father and conjures the large shield. Suffering the kamikaze attack, the shield manages to resist. Their ship falls to the ground. Our protagonist is disoriented by the shockwave and thinks he managed to use the artifact in time. He wonders what happened to the sky fortress. When he sees, he is relieved that they managed to retreat quickly. Adrian then orders everyone to check the situation of the vanguards and take care of the wounded soldiers. Sometime later, Count Otis laughs. He praises Brigadier Lawrence, saying that his performance was incredible, and our protagonist is grateful. The chubby man says he was amazing in noticing the kamikaze attack, and of all, they were the only ones who managed to protect themselves successfully. He told the local commander that this victory was because of the protagonist, so he should receive a reward, and our protagonist thanks again. Count Otis says it's no big deal to ensure that his employees get a treat for a good contribution, and the protagonist thinks this count is very good. He also says that there are some weird rumors about the protagonist that make him curious, about him having tamed a giant eagle, and they said he communicates with her in a mysterious way, and this makes the protagonist embarrassed. The boy says he is only taking care of her because he found her fascinating, and the chubby man finds it admirable, asking if he can understand animals. One of the men says that this eagle must be an intelligent breed with a high level of mana, and our protagonist pretends not to know that. He thinks it's a relief that the Duke gave him a support that exists in this world instead of a flashy one, and the Count laughs, imagining that the eagle is no different from a puppy. The boy asks if he can access the internet now that the enemy has retreated. As a reward, the chubby man allows it, and the protagonist thanks him. 2 weeks after the war began, someone calls Mr. Billiam. This someone warns not to show themselves, as it could be a trap, and everyone understands. Leader Billiam tells everyone not to fully trust the radar and to keep moving and maintaining distance. Everyone agrees, while the leader thinks about how Brigadier Lawrence gained everyone's trust in just 2 weeks. Sometime later, they end up falling into a trap. The leader orders them to retreat, while thinking that if they hadn't listened to the protagonist's orders, they probably would have been caught by surprise. Entering a direct confrontation, everyone is under pressure. He thinks it was lucky they were killed quickly, but they should wait for support while holding off several other soldiers. He imagines it will take a while for reinforcements to arrive, but suddenly the commander orders them to advance. Something falls, creating a cloud of dust. Everyone is impressed, and he asks if they are okay. 10 vanguards under the command of Count Otis arrived as reinforcements. Billiam thinks they arrived very quickly and wonders if the protagonist knew this would happen. Mockingly, our protagonist asks why they are not attacking, informing that the enemies are backed against the mountains, making Billiam calmer. Our protagonist says it's hard to get reinforcements, so they will defeat at least 5 units. The gathered leaders praise the protagonist's command and the way his team is performing better than the others. The Count had thought that the protagonist was lucky, but doesn't seem to be the case anymore, and he thinks about the case of him becoming an idiot after almost dying from poison. He thinks the protagonist is really interesting and remembers that his age is almost the same as his daughter Michelle's, revealing that if his family allows it, he would like to bring him to his side, which scares everyone. They say that the protagonist is already dating, and the Count says it's no problem to have another mistress, and the others remember that he is addicted to games. The Count thinks this is better than being addicted to drugs and other things. The others suggest waiting a little longer due to his daughter Michelle's personality, and the Count thinks she can really be a bit temperamental. Changing the subject, the Count says to send a report to the command corps. Elsewhere, Mr. Billiam calls the protagonist, asking if he has a moment, and our protagonist says yes. He asks for it to be quick and notices that now he is favorable and eager. The old man asks why he hides his strength, and the protagonist thinks he is going too fast, explaining that he believes he is a better lord than his brother, who can cause a crisis in the territory with his behavior, and says he will give his support if he competes with his brother. The protagonist realizes that he is being sincere and is grateful for his words, giving hope to the old man. However, our protagonist will pretend not to have heard this, which surprises Billiam. Adrien pats his shoulder, thinking he is naive and spoke without thinking properly. He thinks that Cedric has a lot of information and therefore must act carefully. But alone, he is more than enough. Alone, he will end his brother and stepmother and will not share this joy with anyone. He smiles, looking back a little, thinking that at least there are people who are concerned about the well-being of the territory. Now he remembers that he will be awarded a medal after all and thinks it won't be a big deal. Elsewhere, someone says that for his deeds and contributions, Adrien Lawrence will receive the Golden Lion Medal. The person who bestows such honor is the king of the kingdom of Reinhardt. The protagonist says he will honor this medal for the rest of his life, thinking that his brother will go crazy when he sees this. In the office, his brother hits the table with hatred. Enviously, he says it would have been him who would have received all these merits if he had gone to war. He asks his mother about his father and she says he is with Adrien's poor mother. Cedric says he is spending too much time with her and his mother needs to do something. However, his mother says she cannot simply poison him. Her son yells at her and she tells him to lower his tone and says that the reason he spends so much time with that woman is entirely Adrien's fault. Cedric asks if he will leave the family after the war and his mother confirms, saying he must be thinking of a way to make a living. The old woman starts trying to calm her son, saying that Adrien is not his competitor. She says she will ensure everything and Cedric trusts her words. He has the support of his maternal grandfather and his mother controls most of the Lawrence Viscounty. His father is just a temporary governor who will hand over his power and territory to him. But a doubt still remains in his head. He has always looked at his brother with envy and anger, seeing him receive praise over and over again, and he finds all this very annoying because it is not him, thinking that he was reduced to a useless person after they tried to poison him. So why does he keep annoying him so much? Cedric's head is filled with thoughts of anger and anguish about Adrien. A few weeks after the war, our protagonist offers a drink to the vanguards. Each of them thanks as they are served. The soldiers talk about feeling invigorated and excited now, but the protagonist thinks that's obvious after all. They are drinking an elixir with a drop of legendary medicine. He thinks it's a waste, but it's necessary for the war to end quickly. The vanguards will patrol, and as they say goodbye, someone calls the protagonist, saying that the division commander is requesting him, which confuses him. He extends a piece of dried meat and gives it to his giant eagle that eats, then flies away as the protagonist watches from his transport, saying that the count has called him quite a bit, and the man laughs, saying he trusts the protagonist. Our protagonist thinks it's annoying, but he can't do anything about it. Our protagonist stands confused with a goblet in hand, noticing that the other commanders are also present. He looks around thinking he could have sent a message if it were a matter of battle. The protagonist thinks he has something important to announce, and the chubby man appears above with a radiant smile, telling them to rejoice for not having to hear the shots, announcing that the end of the war is very near. He explains that currently the ministers are having a meeting. The count explains that this war was not intended to last long, but rather to be just an annual event. The commanders think they are fools, and our protagonist says that it is happening similarly to his past life. Then he asks about the vanguards that were sent. The count explains that they must continue this war game until the end, leaving the protagonist uncomfortable. Excited, the chubby man tells him to relax, reminding him that because of his honor in battle, he has won several rewards and will win more at the end of the war. Our protagonist agrees, raising his goblet. Toasting, he thinks he needs to evolve and worry about himself. Billiam thinks it's a good thing. The protagonist and Archia remain silent, observing him. The protagonist asks what would happen if the country entered a total war, and the old man says there would be immense losses and annihilations, thinking it would be an unimaginable catastrophe. Our protagonist says he should have rested more and asks his reason for being there. He extends his hand to Archia, who hands him a sweet. Then he offers it to Billiam, who asks what it is. The protagonist says it was a gift from Count Otis, so it must be precious. Eating the sweet, he says the young master is truly different from the other nobles, saying he feels empathy and even goes to the front of the war for his men. He says he understands for having once been a common person, but he says that he also has the composure and dignity of a true noble, leaving the protagonist confused. He says the protagonist was drinking black tea while the enemy troops approached with absolute confidence, and it was because of this composure that soldiers like him were able to relax. Affirming that everyone in the 232nd Brigade trusts him, the protagonist understood that he is mentioning that he will support him as a successor. But before he can say anything, Billiam kneels. Impressing the protagonist, he says he has trustworthy men that no one approaches and also does not need to worry about surveillance devices. The protagonist becomes serious, thinking that they are all on his father's side. Our protagonist sighs, saying he understands. But this behavior may attract attention, and the old man says that's why they came while the others rest, saying that he, the servant Gilbert Billiam, would like to serve the second young master of the Lawrence family as his lord from that day on. The boy asks if the others outside think the same way, and he confirms. Our protagonist falls silent, thinking for a moment. Then he says he will accept this, making the old man happy. But there is one condition, and the old man asks what it is. Adrian says he must act normally, which worries the old man for a moment. The protagonist says he will not be insignificant and says he has a plan to win, and therefore he needs to follow his orders. He asks how many knights will follow him, and the old man says 5 vanguards and about 30 knights. But this number could double, and our protagonist thinks it will not be bad. He stands up, saying it is good enough. But before leaving, Billiam says he has one more thing to tell, explaining that the protagonist's stepmother Anna wishes to assign Perseus to him, and perhaps it would be a good idea to recruit him as soon as possible, leaving the protagonist surprised to hear this name. He remembers that he was the deputy commander of the Order of Knights and his skills were impressive, but the boy thought he had left the order for being involved in the political struggle of Anna's family. Billiam says that with his return, many knights may change their minds. Adrian knows that this is the typical popular knight, that is, who can expand his army just with his inclusion, and perhaps it is enough to compete with the forces of Anna and Cedric, and thinks that this is not a bad idea, especially considering it is a power he can use outside the family. The boy tells the man to arrange a secret meeting with him. Loyally, the man says he will investigate. Leaving the room, the soldiers bow. Our protagonist thinks that power is good, but he has another goal. Picking up his glasses, he says his top priority is to complete the mission of meeting with Fortune and forming his 7th degree circle. In the game, our protagonist died along with Arcia and his eagle. The system informs him to try again when he recovers his experience. Our hero screams in desperation, preparing a spell. He asks Arcia to protect him. Throughout this time, our protagonist has not experienced death, even though it is normal to overcome difficulties in a game. The problem is that he will feel immense pain upon dying. Even Arcia is being pushed back with the attacks. He thinks that he always maintained his own safety in every fight, but this time it's different. Arcia and her eagle are attacked and end up being defeated, leaving only our protagonist, who will be killed by the Death Knight Pascal. The boy realizes that he is not just a master of aura, but also has an abnormally strong body. Being killed, the protagonist thinks that he is on a much higher level. The system resurrects him in a nearby village. He puts his hand on his chest, feeling the pain. Our protagonist thinks that he cannot complain about his pain with so many people around. Opening the system, he thinks it was too easy until now. Our protagonist uses a resurrection scroll to resurrect his support. Arcia apologizes to the protagonist. The protagonist asks if she's okay, and she says she can handle the pain. Relieved, the boy sighs. He recruited her without thinking because of her status as a tank. The deeper their relationship gets, the more embarrassed he feels for staying behind her, and feels he needs to change his combat style so she doesn't suffer. But in the end, he thinks he needs to change anyway. In the fight, he noticed that there is a limit to his very simple combat style. Arcia protects, the eagle distracts and attacks by surprise, and our protagonist deals all the damage with his magic. They manage to maintain this, but the casting time is delaying the main damage. He imagines that one way to cover this gap is by using the Black Eagle. Arcia's defense works against him, but if she had frequent damage, it would help. He only has 3 options now. Reduce his attack to attack more often, or use the eagle as a warrior who attacks and flees, and finally the option for Arcia to use her sword to deal damage. The first option is very bad, but the other 2 are better, and he tells Arcia that they will try. Then in the second battle, the protagonist died again, and the system tells him to try again. He gets extremely angry at the source, screaming if that is even possible. Resurrecting Arcia, she apologizes, but our protagonist takes the blame. He says he tried to use the 2 as warriors, but the eagle died in less than a minute. Then the protagonist died in 3 minutes and Arcia died shortly after. The biggest problem was that the protagonist's eagle died quickly, according to him. The eagle managed to distract the boss for a while, and he thinks it would be a good idea to equip it with a breastplate. Our protagonist will try again and thinks that it will work eventually. After all, this is a test to reach the 7th circle. However, our protagonist died once again, which makes him full of anger. He thinks it wasn't bad, and it worked a little. Our protagonist began to understand the pattern of the Death Knight, and it will try once more. In the 4th battle, the Death Knight asks if this is serious, asking if he is fighting with a bunch of acrobats. The knight says he has talent for putting him in a good mood and asks if he doesn't want to change classes to clown. Our protagonist asks if he has ever heard of a human bomber. Then he starts launching several magical attacks towards the knight, screaming for him to die while attacking. The knight blocks with his sword while Arcia attacks him. Adrian thinks everything is going well, but his eagle begins to tire, starting to fall and leaving him kneeling in front of the knight, who says scarily that it's good to see him on the ground. Our protagonist gets nervous and says hello to the Lord, until he receives an attack that kills him again. In the 9th battle, our protagonist is tired. They try different formations, and the knight says it's fun to see a mage on the front line. This time, he managed to survive by dodging and caused much more damage than last time. They will try again with items focused on reflexes and not on casting. Now, he will become an evasive mage that no one has ever seen. He flees while attacking, managing to dodge attacks while charging his spell, dodging with more and more dexterity, launching several simultaneous attacks while attacking with Arcia. But the knight avoids the attacks, hitting both and defeating them. Our protagonist this time gives a smile, thinking that he finally managed to find a way to win. Being an evasive mage, he managed to last 62 minutes and caused 84% damage to the knight, and if he keeps trying, he will surely be able to win. He gets up from the bed, taking off his glasses, thinking that he exceeded his connection time. He thought they would finish level 200 that day, but they are stuck in an unexpected place. Stretching, he feels something strange, saying that he's feeling his body slower, and Arcia explains that it is normal after experiencing death and resurrection several times. Then he asks if she feels the same. She can't say, but she feels that she is stronger in some way, saying that this is because of the experience she gained. Our protagonist thinks he is used to it. But Arcia seems to be becoming more and more human as she continues to experience these things. The girl asks if he has any orders for her, but he says no. He will sleep and says they will try again when he wakes up, and she agrees. After numerous battles and attempts, in the 18th battle, everyone is still alive. The Death Knight begins to disintegrate. Before dying, he praises the protagonist for having dealt 100% damage. Raising his arms, he celebrates, happy that they finally managed to win. The system congratulates him for completing the 7th level of the mission of Meaning of Fortune. Sometime later on the 8th floor of the tower, the protagonist mentions that this floor was much larger compared to the others, and that it was very detailed because everything was real, questioning if this time there would be 2 enemies. However, the homunculus girl asks him to calm down and giving a smile. Observing the magic, they realize it was an elf with the appearance of an old man. Adrian asks if that wouldn't be his new support, mentioning that it seemed very familiar. Then the elf wakes up, saying his name was Chester, affirming that he took care of Destiny and was also a fragment of Manuel Lucas, leaving Adrian surprised. Continuing to talk, Chester says that he was also an NPC, but was created from the memories of Manuel Lucas. The protagonist, observing the situation, thinks that even if he was created with the memories of Manuel Lucas, nothing guaranteed that he would help him. Supposing that the dwarf could retrieve his things, Chester says there was no need to worry. Adrian mentions that Chester did not seem like an NPC and was very different from the others because he seemed to be alive. Chester says that he did not have a soul but was not created to act in a specific way because he was created with someone's living memories. Then the protagonist supposes that even if Manuel Lucas couldn't beat old age, he would always live in that place. Chester says that it could be seen that way because it was the main reason for the creation of Hollywood. But nothing was eternal because he was just a shadow of someone who was already gone. His job was not to live forever as an NPC, but to live in the lives of future generations. No matter how much he tried to create a clone, he would never be Manuel Lucas indeed. If the idea was really to create a clone to live forever, it would not be in the virtual world. It would only need a homunculus like Arcia. Adrian thinks that he believed Manuel Lucas would try to possess him to be able to live or something like that, but fortunately, that was not the case, questioning why the dwarf was there. Mentioning that the previous floor had been very difficult, asking if he would stop fighting and focus on other areas besides that one. Then Chester waves his staff, where a system window appears. The system informs that Adrian had gained 5 uses of the Hollywood System Administrator Authority. Chester mentions that Adrian's destiny was to get everything Manuel Lucas had, and it was expected that his authority would also be given to him. However, initially there would be limitations, but over time they would disappear. He could also use the Administrator Authority in any program based on the Hollywood system. Adrian is surprised because, despite Hollywood being a virtual world, it was no different from the internet on Earth. But Chester mentions that there were rules for using the authority. Adrian says that he had been worried, but the rules made sense because he wasn't sure who would gain the permissions, asking if he could launder the money he had earned. Chester responds that he had some methods, and one of them was creating false stock investment reports. The protagonist asks if it wasn't risky if someone reviewed the documents, but Chester says that the probability was low. Adrian responds that he would like to use one of his permissions. The fragment informs that his fortune was 12 trillion loots, asking if the boy would like to organize the loots he would gain from that floor. Questioning if he wanted anything else, Adrian responds that Arcia needed to have a record. Meeting the protagonist's demands, Adrian thinks that he was no different from a genie in a lamp, asking if he was there to help him with the administrator authorities. Then Chester responds that he was. Adrian questions why he went so far for people he never knew. Chester responds that it was a way to show longing because he didn't want the lives of other people to be as difficult as his. Adrian thinks that those didn't seem like the words of someone history would call legendary, and if it wasn't for Manuel creating a legacy for future generations, his life would be pathetic because he couldn't even dream of what it would be today. Thanking the fragment, but he says he was not Manuel Lucas. Looking at the fragment, Adrian thinks he had just smiled or it was his imagination. Then the system informs that he had gained 50 trillion loots and had also acquired the fortress in the sky of Icarus. Meanwhile, in the city of Nishheim, the former vice captain of the Order of the Knights hears about Adrian's name. Then another guy talking about the protagonist mentions that if he took control of the territory, everything would develop even more than it is now, asking if he would support the protagonist. However, the captain, furious, thinks he was called for another reason, but the man says the young man was a prodigy. The man mentions that he had heard that Adrian had stood out in the war, but asks if the man didn't think the object of trust was too small to act only on that. William apologizes, saying that he wasn't laughing at him, but just remembered that he was in a similar position not long ago, because he thought that the young master Adrian had been lucky and was still the same. Asking if Adrian was still the same, the man says no, and that was just the tip of the iceberg that was shown to the world. Mentioning that he witnessed his abilities because he was on the front lines under the boy's orders and dared to say that Adrian was the greatest genius of that era, saying that the captain would not be able to understand until he saw for himself because even Cedric's allies decided to support Adrian. Then the man thinks that the story of the incredible prodigy who had taken poison and become mediocre was a lie. Considering Adrian's intelligence and Billiam's words, he was sure Adrian deserved his attention, asking Billiam what he had to do. Then the guy asks him to use his contacts to convince the neutral vassals to support Adrian. The captain, in turn, thinks that it was a very complicated task, and that it was very interesting. Billiam says it was a great decision, but the captain says he hadn't yet said he would support Adrian because before making a decision, he should at least meet him. The guy says that the young master would love to visit him, and that he would call Adrian to tell him about his willingness. While Billiam was talking to the protagonist, the captain thinks he would see if his words were true and if Adrian really deserved his support. However, when Billiam finishes the call, he gets nervous, saying that Adrian must be very busy to hang up the call. At the same moment, they both notice something. Feeling an extremely smooth mana, they suppose it was a spatial control magic of at least the 7th circle. Then Adrian appears on the scene, saying that from their expressions they didn't know they were surrounded and that it didn't surprise him because they came with various artifacts, giving an order for Arcia to take out all of them, defeating the 5 assassins. The protagonist says that maybe he had too many expectations because he had heard they were the most powerful on the continent, but even so, they were surrounded by assassins. Billiam questioning what had just happened, and Adrian mentions that he had spent 13 years preparing for that moment, and if he thought he was unprepared, because it was expected that he would have an Aura Master by his side. The captain, observing the situation, questions what he was thinking because he should be concerned about being useful to him, and that was the kind of person in front of him. Adrian, seeing the former captain's skills, thinks he was not bad at all. The man asks if it was Adrian who had sent them, and the boy confirms, saying that they must have many questions, using a repair ability, leaving the man surprised because the bloodstains and bodies disappeared. Adrian, in turn, says they would go to another place, using a teleportation magic. The Kingdom of Moons, the nation with the most mages behind the 4 empires, and yet if you asked anyone about the most famous, everyone would say just one name. Dukine Riverdale, a great mage and a successful professor who trained 6 7th circle mages, and they always say the same thing. The greatest mage in history is Lucas, but the greatest professor is Dukine Riverdale. Disbelieving the protagonist's explanation, he asks if he had been his professor, remembering he had died years ago. Adrian affirms that he had indeed died. However, he was the one who taught him everything he knew and was able to learn everything without any problem. The man, in turn, asks how he had learned since he spent most of his time playing. The boy replies that that was the only place where he could train without restriction, because Kine taught him in both worlds. However, everything Adrian was saying was a lie. An archmage falling from the sky, no one would ever believe he was only 20 years old. The best way to make people believe was to use the title of Riverdale's disciple. Moreover, he came prepared because he had a platinum plaque and a hologram of them together. That was not real because he basically asked ADM Chester to make them so he could use them. Just like what he was holding, there were several traces of Riverdale and a record of having a secret disciple that no one knew who it was. So even Riverdale's family or his disciples might trust Adrian if they ended up meeting him. He would even like to say he was the heir to Lucas's destiny, but if he said that he would never have peace again, saying that Arcia and he would take care of Anna and Cedric. And they shouldn't worry about expanding the influences and rallying people for that. The man asks why he was called there. Adrian, in turn, mentions that it was his plan from the beginning, because he had something he could do for the boy, asking him to extend his hand, placing his watch on the man's wrist. Then a system window with an exclamation point appears, informing that there were 20 billion loot in the account, asking if he would like to share the information, saying he wanted the man to create a group under his command to gather information, thinking that the jobs they would do would be dirty and something necessary to achieve his plans, mentioning that it was cruel to ask this kind of work from a knight. The guy says they would probably face Raven, but it would be necessary, questioning if Adrian was sure because it must have been almost impossible to gather wealth. Adrian, in turn, asks him not to worry about that because he could get that amount very easily and had a talent for investing, thinking the guy would faint if he said he had 3,000 times more, saying he would take Cedric's place and inherit the family, and he would have power that no one in that nation could disrespect, questioning if the man would be by his side. Bowing to the protagonist, the guy says he had his loyalty. Meanwhile, at the Lawrence family house, the lady asks if 5 expert assassins had disappeared without a trace, questioning if the guy hadn't said they could kill anyone as long as they were an Aura Master or a Great Mage. When the man was about to speak, the woman asks why they failed and where Perseus and Billiam were. The man responds, saying Bilium had returned to his unit, but Perseus' location remained unknown. The lady in turn says he must be alive because Bilium would report to her husband if Perseus had died, thinking that if those two are together, they must be plotting against her, affirming she shouldn't have neglected the situation. Remembering her husband's words, she assumed she had no choice but to obey because if she went against the Viscount at that moment, things would get worse. But the actions went beyond expectations and everyone was talking about his deeds in the war, where he would earn a title when it ended, and other people and knights would help Adrian. If Bilium and Perseus joined forces, they would become unstoppable, so she couldn't let them do as they pleased. The servant in turn asks how she would like to handle the Assassin's Guild, as they had guaranteed they could handle the job. Then he questions if they should kill Adrian, leaving the butler confused. With a threatening look, the woman asks if he was afraid because it was the easiest way. However, if she did that, there would be no turning back with Viscount Lawrence. Moreover, Adrian was very famous. The lady, in turn, questions how long the butler had worked for her. Saying it would be his 30th year, the woman grabs a bottle, affirming that he should already know that she hated being contradicted, pouring wine on the guy's head, questioning if he thought she didn't know what she was doing, affirming that there was no other way but that one, asking if the guy thought he was smarter than her. Desperate, the man apologizes, saying it would never happen again. The woman in turn says she would incriminate him, because it wasn't just a dying commoner anymore, but the Viscount's son was dying, so someone needed to take responsibility for that. And for all that time, the butler had shown his loyalty, so it would be easier this time. The man in turn says he would prove his loyalty. The lady says to ensure it this time because if he failed again, they would die. Surprised, the butler thinks she was discarding him after 30 years of loyalty just because he said something wrong. And if the young master could pass that trial, maybe he could too. Meanwhile, the protagonist was celebrating his victory in the battle, being happy that the end of the war was declared safely. The other man says he never thought he would gain recognition, but thanks to the protagonist, he was looking forward to the commendation ceremony. Then the other people start thanking the boy. Adrian thinks they were taking credit for something he did, but that was normal, thinking that if he had taken the rewards just for himself, that wouldn't have happened. Adrian in turn says that everything only happened because the man trusted his wisdom, leaving the man embarrassed, asking if it would have been better if the war had continued a little longer. Worried, the guy says that if the war continued and Adrian had received more recognition, he could end up becoming a lord, but with what he has now, the reward would be limited. The boy in turn remembers that there was a big difference between inheriting a title and earning one on his own. No matter how high his position rose, he didn't have a county, so he couldn't pass his title down. So Adrian says it's okay because he didn't fight expecting something in return. The guy mentions that he had a lot of potential, but he didn't have a place to fully express it. But the boy thinks he would be the legitimate heir of his family as soon as he removes Cedric. The Count in turn mentions that he could get involved with his family, mentioning that he had a daughter and could do that if he wanted. So Adrian says he would think about it. The Count says to consider it because he would welcome him with open arms. But Adrian thinks that his daughter was known for being a maniac. However, that wasn't his problem anyway, it didn't matter. Remembering that he could finally go back. And when he returned, Anna and Cedric would see things they never expected to happen. The day after the war ended, the provincial army was immediately disbanded. The other captains greeted the protagonist, telling him to visit them. Sometime later, Adrian was already in the game, mentioning that he was already tired because he evolved like crazy every time he had free time, saying that the requirement to face the luck mission at level 8 was 250, but he was at level 202. And it had been 10 days since he reached level 200, and it seemed like he wasn't progressing at all, supposing that he thought his combat skills had improved since the battle against the Death Knight. As they got stronger, the monsters also did, and the experience limit had increased. So it was impossible to level up once a day as it was before, but that was not an individual problem, because that monster they just killed needed at least a group of 5 people, questioning if he should find a new member for the group. However, he couldn't do that, and it was better not to attract attention because he already had the luck encounter. Thinking he should treat it as a lesson, he called Arcia. However, the girl was motionless. Then the raven appears. Adrian asks what happened, questioning if there was something outside. When he logs out of the game, he realizes that Arcia was defending him, using her great shield ability to protect the girl. Arcia, in turn, says they were assassins similar to the ones they had dealt with before. Adrian asks since when assassins used aura swords, but she wasn't sure, mentioning that they were armed with armor and aura swords. The protagonist mentions that he was very calm considering that there were 3 vanguards wanting to kill him. And the girl says that Bilium was prepared for any attack as he had delayed them, and his troops were dealing with them now. Adrian thinks that with 5 vanguards, it shouldn't be difficult. However, for Arcia, it wouldn't be easy. Among the rubble, several eyes appear, and that was a shootlet golem, mentioning that there were 6 in total, and she thinks the lady changed her target to him instead of Mr. Bilium and Perseus. Handing an aura sword to Arcia, the boy questions if that would be enough. Adrian, in turn, grabs a staff capable of reducing the amount of magical power consumed. Meanwhile, the golem tried to attack the barrier, but it was insufficient, The protagonist says he chose the wrong target, using the flame explosion ability, throwing the golems into the air, where that explosion went out of the aircraft. Taking advantage of the hole, Adrian leaves the aircraft, giving a signal to Arcia. Meanwhile, the Vanguard captain receives a call from one of his servants saying that something was wrong. But to the man, they should have finished it by now. Noticing the explosion caused by the protagonist, the man gets nervous, asking why a monster like that was hidden in the Lawrence family, giving the order to kill the boy because he was interfering with the teleportation. But they couldn't because there was an aura master nearby. The guy thinks he's going crazy because not only was there an archmage, but also an aura master, saying that now they were on their own. The protagonist, in turn, doesn't let him escape, using magic to trap the Vanguard guy. Arcia, in turn, advances towards the guy. About to attack the man, Adrian asks her to stop, affirming that it was no use trying to escape, suggesting that he could live if he helped them. At that moment, the man kills himself. Checking the man's pulse, Arcia mentions that he was dead, because he had chewed poison hidden in his molars. Adrian says that since he didn't have much experience, he ended up underestimating their determination. A group of vanguards arrives, calling the protagonist. Then the guy responds that Adrian was Duke Riverdale's disciple, leaving the men surprised, starting to talk about the protagonist, because before, everyone underestimated him. The vice commander in turn says that Adrian had managed to become that way because he was special and was making plans behind the scenes. Hearing the man's words, Adrian is surprised, mentioning that Billiam was very good at influencing people. Sometime later in the Lawrence family county, the protagonist meets his mother. With tears on her face, the woman questions if he was hurt anywhere. While hugging his mother, his father says he had worked hard. Adrian thinks it was completely normal to hold a celebration parade. However, it was very calm there. His father apologizes because he should have given a grand reception, but to the boy it was alright because he didn't like noisy events, thinking it must be Anna and Cedric's doing, because who would bother to hold a parade for someone who was about to die? His father in turn says that in exchange, they prepared a great banquet, leaving the boy apprehensive. Then the system notifies that power-saving mode was activated, so Adrian smiles. At the banquet, everyone greets the protagonist. Some say they managed to come back alive only because of him, and his father asks if he had learned to win people over on the battlefield. Then Anna and Cedric appear. Bowing to the woman, Adrian mentions that it had been 3 months since they last met, so she welcomes them. Observing Anna's anger, Adrian mentions that she looked like she had seen a ghost. Observing the other man, he questions what happened to him, noticing on the system window that he was relieved and happy. Seeing the other guy's stats, the protagonist thinks it was expected a knight commander. Cedric, in turn, says that as someone who carried the family name, he had done a good job, affirming that even if it wasn't a big deal, he should be praised. Adrian thinks he would love to cut off their heads right now, but should find some justifications first. Cedric asks if he felt good being praised, calling him a bastard. Adrian, in turn, asks if he thought he would be happy hearing his praises. And it was ridiculous to talk as if he was capable of doing anything, because if he had led those people on the battlefield, he would have been completely annihilated, leaving the guy furious with the protagonist's words. Continuing, Adrian says that people should know how to use their heads better as they get older, and that's why his vassals called him an idiot, leaving the guy completely furious. Then one of the butlers drops one of his plates. The boy asks if Anna had something to say, and if she did, to speak directly. Cedric in turn starts laughing, mentioning that he had become more rude after returning from the battlefield. Pointing his sword at Adrian, Cedric says he didn't even know what fear was anymore. However, his father appears to intervene in the situation, but the protagonist asks him to stay quiet and just watch. Cedric says he had him in the palm of his hand and understood why he acted that way, because it should be the cause of the investigation of that rebel, asking how he dared to try to bring down that family, pointing his sword at Billiam. Confused as to why it was him, Cedric continues to speak, mentioning that Billiam had persuaded Adrian to try to tear apart that family. Starting to argue, Cedric orders them to capture him immediately. However, his soldiers don't move. Cedric asks what they were doing, telling them to hurry and carry out his order, affirming that if they wanted to capture Vice Commander Billiam, they should do it themselves. Cedric in turn questions what he was talking about, advancing with his sword towards the protagonist. However, Arcia intervenes in the situation, asking what was with that girl and why she was so strong. Noticing the man's resistance, the girl strikes him with a piece of chicken, leaving everyone surprised because Cedric had been knocked out. Observing the situation, Adrian thinks that after Cedric had done all that, he was being beaten by a woman half his size. The other man in turn intervenes in the situation, affirming that he was crossing a line he shouldn't cross. But Adrian in turn asks if it wasn't him who was crossing the line, thinking that during all that time he had committed several things he couldn't even remember. Cedric, furious, says that they dared to hurt him and therefore should die. The other guy then says that they really needed to die. However, as a vassal, he couldn't harm the second young master who was a member of the Lord's family. But it was a different story with that girl, pointing his sword at Arcia, mentioning that there was no room for consideration for a person who dared to raise hands against a noble. Meanwhile, the girl calmly observed the situation, The man, in turn, asks if she thought she was a noble just because she had become a lover of one. At that moment, several soldiers surround him. Then Billiam, pointing his sword, asks the man to step away from Arshia. Observing the soldiers, the guy thinks there were also people from Cedric's faction. Surprised because even those guys were willing to follow the protagonist. Then several soldiers appear. Adrian realizes that reinforcements had arrived, questioning if all that was Anna's plan. Cedric, in turn, warns that it was no use regretting, mentioning that they would be severely punished for their crimes. Adrian says they were in the presence of the Lord, questioning how they dared to stand on the opposite side of their king. Then Cedric gives the order to subdue them, advancing towards the protagonist. Observing the situation, Adrian thinks that numerically they were stronger. However, the other group was properly armed, and if a large-scale battle began, it would be a massacre. The other guy, in turn, says that because he was drunk with his victory, he forgot his position, and the system of that family couldn't be changed. Because of his recklessness, the only people who would end up seeing blood would be these guys. As for him, he wouldn't be killed. However, even if he survived, he would only await hell. Then his father asks him to use the artifact. The man orders his soldiers to advance. Meanwhile, Billiam protects the protagonist. Adrian, in turn, says they were rebelling because they were trying to harm the Lord. The man, confused, questions what they were doing. Billiam mentions that anyone could see they were betraying them, removing the ability that enveloped Arshia's body. Adrian asks her to take care of the rest while he handled the other three. Following the boy's order, Arshia instantly disappears, decapitating the group of soldiers. Slapping the man, the protagonist mentions that a traitor needed discipline. The man is surprised because the protagonist, who was a gaming addict, had managed to deal damage, giving an order for his soldiers to surround Arshia. Adrian says that he still managed to give instructions to his subordinates in the midst of all that, though it wouldn't change anything, saying he would teach them a life lesson by increasing his attributes. Mages can use Magic 2 classes below their level without needing to cast, and that meant Adrian was a 7th Circle Mage, and an ability that proves his status as an Archmage is called Memorize. The moment they become Archmages, the so-called weakness of a mage, which was casting, almost disappears. At that moment, the protagonist uses flame magic on the man. Observing Cedric and Anna, the boy says he would enjoy himself from then on. Then the man is still alive, attacking Adrian. However, the boy dodges, questioning why he had gotten up, leaving Cedric and his mother surprised because Adrian had become an Archmage. Cutting to Anna's father, the man is furious with the protagonist, asking how he dared. Watching a video of everything that had happened, her father questions what that was. One of the servants mentions that the video was being broadcast on various platforms, and by tomorrow, most people would be aware of it. Some people speculated that Cedric and Anna's acts of betrayal were done with his support, but for Raven, what the commoners said meant nothing. However, even some nobles supported those speculations. Raven, in turn, says the most they could do is present some complaints. No matter how valuable an Archmage and an Aura Master are, this is not a time when war can be won with superhumans. Moreover, helping those two would be like opposing Raven, who has military power equivalent to a duke and a marquis combined. The servant says the royal family might intervene. Raven affirms because an Archmage and an Aura Master would draw people's attention. However, only if it were true, because they could simply turn those two into imposters, and as long as no one believes they are an Archmage and an Aura Master, there would be no problem. Starting to discuss the video's authentication, and through this video, they were exposing that he was behind Anna and Cedric, mentioning that the commoners were acting as they wanted, because they were just trying to obtain a justification, but what they really wanted was war, leaving the men surprised. Saying it was impossible, and if they were thinking of provoking the Marquis, Raven asks how many of their forces could be mobilized in a territorial war. Answering, the man says there would be more than 3 fortresses and over 200 vanguards, and at the moment, 200 vanguards and a flying fortress were available. The man thinks that it was enough, thinking that the boy was still learning things, questioning how he dared to challenge him, affirming that it was a war and he would make him regret it. Returning to the protagonist, the boy thinks that at that moment, they must be checking his video and preparing for a war. And the relationship between Anna and Raven is inseparable anyway, where his revenge would only be complete when he attacks Raven. While the girl approaches Adrian, he thinks that before that, to solidify his position, there were conditions to be met. The woman in turn says she is Riverdale's daughter and her name is Olivia. Duchess Olivia Riverdale, an Archmage belonging to the Kingdom of Luz. Daughter of the famous Riverdale, although it is said that she is closer to the 8th Circle among the Archmages of the Kingdom of Luz, her existence was equal to that of the Patriarch. Unlike Adrian, who gained strength through lucky encounters, she was a true genius who reached the 7th Circle at 22 years old. Olivia, observing the boy, tells her servants that it was true, and the protagonist asks if they recognized it. However, she says it seemed real because it was completely impossible to falsify that platinum plaque. With a penetrating look, Olivia observes Adrian. The boy, feeling pressured, stands up, asking what the meaning of that was. With a smile, Olivia says it was incredible, saying it was nothing special because she just wanted to test his abilities, but for Adrian, there were other ways to verify without doing it that way. Olivia mentions that having 7 circles didn't mean everyone was equal, and she just wanted to measure his level. Adrian questions if he had earned her recognition, and the girl says she still had some questions but had no reason to refuse. The boy realizes she didn't care if it was real or not and seemed to be just welcoming a new archmage, questioning what would happen if he turned into a villain. But Olivia says it was impossible for anyone to have the courage to face her family. Adrian, in turn, thinks that now that he had received her recognition, there was no reason to argue further, saying that he would like to make a request. The next day, the other knight says it would take about an hour to mobilize the troops. Raven questions if it couldn't be a bit faster. Then one of the servants appears, asking the man to watch that video. In the broadcast, Olivia says she wants to make an announcement, affirming that young Master Adrian was a true disciple of her father and had become a 7th Circle Archmage at only 20 years old, mentioning that he was a rare magic genius and a talent expected to reach the 8th Circle, and her branch would do its best to help him grow. Watching the video, Raven is surprised, thinking that Adrian was already a step ahead of him. Continuing the video, the girl says that if they tried to harm him, her family would consider it an act of war against them. Then the man throws the device to the ground, giving the order to proceed as planned. However, the other servant is confused because Raven had just heard what Olivia had said. Raven in turn says to ignore it, questioning if they had heard about his expedition. And in any case, he would achieve his objectives. Even so, the servant says that Riverdale was on Adrian's side, and therefore they should call off the expedition. Shouting, the man says it didn't matter because they were foreigners anyway. Moreover, Adrian would be relieved if they couldn't attack, so the surprise attack would be more effective. Therefore, they should finish the preparations and mobilize their troops as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, Adrian remembered his conversation with Olivia, questioning if the boy desired only that. And now she understood his situation, mentioning that if he wanted, she could provide support as a colleague, but for the boy, it was only necessary to reveal that he was Riverdale's disciple. Returning to the present, Adrian tells Arcia that it was time to go, thinking that when it came to revenge, he didn't want anyone's help because it was something done for personal satisfaction. Everything should go according to his plan, and under his leadership, that family would be his prey, telling the girl that he didn't want to share the joy of hunting them with others. Meanwhile, in a prison, one of the guards reports that some prisoners had escaped, saying they could be hiding somewhere and ordering them to be searched. And the fugitives were Anna and Cedric. Climbing the stairs, Anna says it was the same as being dead, mentioning that her father wouldn't leave them alone. Cedric questions if their mother would really do that, but the mother says they couldn't live that way. Unlocking the door with the key, they leave the prison. Looking up, they notice a gigantic building. Then Anna points the key to the sky where a system window appears for the woman, who then teleports the group. With a threatening look, Anna says she would ensure that Adrian dies, questioning if he thought she would stand still as she could destroy and hide with that flying fortress. Using the key, the system begins to verify. The system informs that the administrator was unstable, questioning if it should activate the fortress under threats. The woman responds no, and the system begins to verify her. Informing that the activation was complete, the woman tells them to prepare the weapons, ordering them to aim at Viscount Lawrence. About to fire, the protagonist appears, saying that he acted perfectly as planned, thanking them for unlocking the flying fortress's security. At that moment, the other guy advances towards the protagonist. However, Arcia was also there, knocking the man down. Adrian, in turn, mentions that Anna's crimes only kept increasing and that Raven's troops were almost there, affirming that she and her brother would have to protect that land with their own bodies, questioning if she thought criminals could be proud, saying there were many security measures in the fortress, but she did a good job unlocking it because now he could do whatever he wanted. Changing her expression, the woman tries to talk to the protagonist, and the boy thinks she wasn't the person who tried to blow up the Viscount. While Arcia was punching Cedric, the protagonist asks her to bring the man. Cedric questions why she was doing that since they were siblings. The boy uses his shield ability to trap the two. Arcia questions what they should do with those 3 who start begging for mercy. Adrian says they seem to be people from Marcus Raven, so he would send them there, throwing the 3 out of the fortress. The protagonist mentions that he had forgotten to upload the video, asking Arcia to edit the video for him, affirming that he would use the media platform politically. Sometime later, the news about it was already out. Then Anna's father questions if he could kill all the commoners who were commenting on it. The servant says it wasn't impossible, but it wouldn't be easy because that site was under Elchia's jurisdiction, and they don't reveal user information unless it was a crime. Mentioning that a flying fortress and 200 vanguards were ready to be dispatched. Raven says they better not fail, and the butler says he would remember that, giving the order for the soldiers to advance, where the mages begin to prepare teleportation magic, transporting the fortress to another location. Raven says he should have gone there personally. Meanwhile, inside the other fortress, Anna was begging the troops not to go. Satisfied, the protagonist realizes they had arrived, giving the order to start the mana wave. Seeing the situation, the two begin to beg the protagonist for forgiveness. However, the protagonist says he was just using what he had learned in the war, and that it was called a suicide bomb, sending the two to the other fortress. Adrian thinks some might say that revenge is meaningless, but the boy totally disagreed, and alcohol had never tasted as sweet as this. The Age of Magic, August 15, 2019, where he erased Anna and Cedric, who had caused so many problems in that world, and now he had achieved his absolute freedom. Meanwhile, Raven wonders why he couldn't contact the soldiers since the mission should already be over. The group of people then starts to discuss it. Raven questions what had happened to the spies they had sent. However, they can't contact any of them, suspecting they were identified and captured. If it wasn't that, Raven couldn't think of another possibility. Furious, he thinks that the whole situation had been planned in advance, and if that were true, it meant he was in the palm of someone who was old enough to be his grandson. Another servant mentions that he was looking for articles related to the Lawrence territory, where he found an article posted 3 minutes ago. According to the article with video, an evacuation notice was made an hour ago, and all the residents of Viscount Lawrence's territory evacuated, mentioning that they had just confirmed that communication had been restored and there was an announcement made by the Lord's castle. Then the furious man punches the table, leaving those present worried. In a rage, he starts throwing objects at his subordinates, questioning how many troops could be deployed at that moment. The servant responds that they had 75 vanguards or 25 vanguards and an aerial fortress. Raven thinks that before the dispatched troops had the strength equivalent to 5 aerial fortresses, and now they should have the strength of 1.5, and no matter how old the Lawrence family's fortress was, it wouldn't matter if his forces hadn't suffered any damage in that explosion. This meant that Adrian knew perfectly well about his movements, but he wouldn't be able to do this his second time since he no longer had aerial fortresses. Then the servant says that number wasn't enough to overpower Lawrence, and an emergency message had arrived from the Imperial family, saying that the use of force against Viscount Lawrence was prohibited. Then the man starts laughing, questioning if that was the price he had to pay for underestimating Adrian. Damage recovery was possible, but they would be unable to do it immediately, and it cost 15 trillion to build a new fortress, and at least 50 billion for Vanguard equipment, as well as 30 trillion for damage recovery alone. Mentioning that the power his family had developed over generations had collapsed due to a small mistake. Asking if the man had said that communication with the Lawrences had increased, asking to call Adrian immediately. Meanwhile, the protagonist says that the Black Eagle was a support like Arcia, but its usage method was completely different. If Arcia was a versatile existence like a human being, the Black Eagle was an auxiliary support that was narrowly focused on that. Then the boy thinks that Raven still had the courage to call him. In the call, the man says it was a mistake to think his luck would continue. Adrian asks him not to worry because his revenge would be complete when his family fell, mentioning that he had left Anna and Cedric in the aerial fortress, and they were certainly very satisfied because he had prepared a cremation ceremony for them. Raven, in turn, asks if he had lost the knowledge of how scary that world could be, but Adrian says he didn't know about the world and wasn't afraid of it. The man says he would never forget that, and the boy would pay for it. Then Adrian thinks that Raven didn't care about Anna and Cedric, and after all they had done, they were nothing but tools, asking if the man was on the 80th floor of the tower, because he had prepared a gift. At the top of the tower was the protagonist's eagle, questioning if he had heard of the memorization magic, which was a unique ability to remove casting time, where he could store up to 10 spells, asking what would happen if he had a 7th circle spell, and if he thought he could break the shield of his castle that he was so proud of. Meanwhile, in the sky next to the eagle, several magic circles appear, leaving the man surprised by what he was seeing. Adrian in turn says that the gift he had sent were 10 7th circle spells, firing him at the tower, informing that the castle's barrier was about to break, asking Raven to use the scroll or teleport to get out of that place. Laughing, he mentions that he would pray for his safety. About to say something to the boy, he ends the call. Then Billiam appears, calling the protagonist, saying that he had done what he asked and gathered the reporters in the conference hall. Observing the surroundings, Adrian thinks that among the maids and servants of the castle, none had underestimated him, thinking it was very funny how they trembled just by seeing him. It was time to say goodbye to his past of pretending to be an idiot, because the second act of his incredible life was just beginning. Seeing the news about the incident, people are shocked, but they are relieved because a young prodigy named Adrian brought down the Marquis. Observing his social networks, he realizes he had gained 1 million followers in just one day, and now he was an influencer. Billiam, in turn, says he was scared to see that people could pressure him for bringing down a noble. But Adrian asks why he cared so much about what others said, affirming that he would never be shaken again. The man thinks that he had lived his entire life being pressured, and the incident with the Marquis caused controversy inside and outside the country, where there were articles stating that the Raven family was still alive. This made the people who were neutral come to his side. It was as if the entire nation was with him and public opinion was in his favor, affirming that he would prove he was different from those nobles and would make a constant announcement with them. Discrimination against commoners was a social problem in noble society in Rondel, and it wasn't because they were inferior. Then his father appears, saying that a summons had arrived for him, Seeing the paper, the boy thinks that the message was short but authoritative, and he could think of three possibilities. The first was a move by Raven. The second was that the nobles were trying to tame them, and the third was that the royal council was also planning it, because they wouldn't send an order if they wanted to make friends, and his father asks if the boy had any plan. Answering that he didn't, he questions his father what the nobles like most. Lawrence responds that it was money. Adrian in turn says he would change their opinions with money, and many nobles would be interested, or even the royalty, saying that he had made money investing, and if he paid some bribes with that money, he would surely change their minds. Observing his parents' expressions, Adrian thinks they didn't seem happy with that, and it was better to show than to talk. Showing the amount of money, William is surprised by those 60 billion, but Adrian asks him to look again because there were 4 commas, not 3, leaving him surprised because it was 60 trillion, questioning if the boy could see the future or had been reincarnated. Adrian asks how much his father thought the fee would be, and Lawrence says at least 1/5 of that money. The protagonist mentions that he heard if a noble paid a large sum as a fee, the royalty guaranteed tax exemption. Thinking that was good because he was already planning to spend some money, then his father questions if there was anything else he wanted to buy. Then Adrian says he was thinking of buying fortresses and vanguards. In the news, the reporter says that Adrian had just declared the fees from the money he made investing, and that amount was 60 trillion, shocking noble society. In another Marcus's house, he says the protagonist was crazy and indeed knew how to surprise people, saying that he wanted Michelle to meet him because he had become very influential. The lady then asks if he couldn't do more because she would love to have him as a son-in-law. Michelle, standing up, says that his face was her type, but she didn't want to be someone who benefited from his money, and she would earn her authority on her own, because it would be easy once she found Manuel Lucas's legacy. Then her mother asks if she was still thinking about that because it was impossible, starting to argue. Then the Marquis affirms that it made perfect sense if Adrian had found his legacy and would explain his courage. And that was perfect for him since he didn't have a strong presence and could hide in the Riverdale family. The lady mentions that Adrian had already announced that he made all that money investing, but the Marquis says that perhaps there was some agreement between the Riverdale family and the royalty. Meanwhile, a news report informs that the Prius Republic had just announced they found Manuel Lucas's legacy, leaving the two surprised by what they were hearing. In Manuel Lucas's tower, Adrian was lying down reading books, thinking it would be easier if he could just absorb the research books like skill books. Reflecting on what he should do the next day, he says he couldn't leave the game because he would be busy, so he needed to stay logged in as much as possible. Affirming that he had less than 1% of military research in those books, and the weapons Lucas invented had changed the course of the war. And the research he dedicated himself to the most was dimensional teleportation, mentioning that he never married or even had a disciple, spending his entire life researching a way to return. The reason he left traces of being from Earth was probably so he could find someone from his homeland. Unfortunately, that happened after his death, and therefore his legacy would be his hope. Saying that he wanted to return to Earth, however, he wasn't obsessed with it because it would be good to go back and forth between the worlds. Wondering if Lucas wanted someone to finish his research or if he wanted to return. If it were that, he would try his best. Then Chester appears, saying that Adrian knew how to earn respect. But to Adrian, he was just an ordinary person, saying that he wanted to ask him a question. Questioning if they wouldn't get caught laundering money, but for Chester, there was a chance. Because if they checked every investor in the world and combined them all, they would see that he had more money than actual exchanges. Adrian thinks it had been good to cover up the Marcus incident with money, but there was too much attention on him. If someone discovered he was the one who found Lucas's legacy, there was a great chance of losing everything he had, so he should keep it a secret, telling Chester that he had a plan, questioning how the operation of the fake lucky holder was going. Meanwhile, at a celebration, many people were praising a man, calling him a national hero, and his name was Louis Fairmont, thinking they should keep celebrating because he was their savior. That guy was the fake lucky holder, a clever agent for the Prius Republic and the son of President Cartro, a second-generation rich kid causing trouble everywhere using his father's name. The operation of the fake lucky holder was to make someone act as the bearer of Lucas's legacy, attracting all the world's attention. With that operation, it could dispel any doubts they had about him, buying time until he reached the 9th circle. Although he didn't feel guilty about handing a bomb to him, it bothered him to leave the name of an archmage with someone like him. The Prius Republic is considered one of the 4 major empires of Rondel, where it was practically the only country that accepted democracy by electing its president. But in reality, corruption and political deals were its foundation, and it wasn't different from a dictatorship as a president could be in power for 14 years. Adrian questions if that would increase President Cartro's approval rating even more. Chester says yes, but the country's situation wouldn't change with or without the news about the encounter. And when the bomb of the fake lucky holder exploded, it would be difficult for Louis and the president to remain intact in the long term. their actions would bring significant changes to the corrupt regime. The protagonist mentions that there were victims because of that operation, and if he could identify them. However, Chester does not accept it, saying that the reason for going so far was his lack of consideration, leaving the boy confused about what he was saying. Chester in turn says that it was unexpected because Adrian was caring so much about other people's lives, questioning if the young man hadn't killed Anna and Cedric without hesitation, but to the boy, they were different enemies. Then Chester says that was a good mentality to have, and they had to prevent innocent casualties while showing no mercy to enemies. Adrian thinks that in those moments he seemed more human than a creature, wondering if when he reached the ninth circle he would be able to create creatures. Then Chester says he hadn't used the last ADM privilege yet and if he wanted to use it. The boy, in turn, says he would use it as an emergency, calling Arcia and Krog and Hunt. Entering a portal, he thinks it would take some time to reach level 250. At the Lawrence family house, rumors began to spread about Adrian wanting to buy new aerial fortresses, where he even planned to have the maximum limit of forces and vanguard equipment. The maids questioned if it was okay for a family to have so many lords, but it was all fine because it was based on merit, affirming that Adrian wasn't just a great noble but would also be equipped with corresponding military capability. In other words, it could be said that he had another kingdom within Ranhart, telling the other maid that they should talk later because Arcia had just called her. So the girls start discussing their shifts. Sometime later, the other maid asks how they dared to challenge their senior. Because most of the servants who worked in the castle were on Anna's side, now that she was dead, they felt lost every day. Despite the Lawrence family members not wanting to face Adrian because of their sins, they still didn't want to leave a job with a guaranteed future. Entering Arcia's room, the maid says she brought her smack. Continuing to think, the maid affirms that as a result, they ended up discussing who would serve Arcia, who was more relaxed. Unlike her title of Aura Master, Arcia had a gentle personality, mentioning that she had come from the same common support as her, but it was amazing how she had risen to the level of a count. Then the maid asks if she could ask her something, asking if young Master Adrian would fire the castle workers. Answering the woman, Arcia says the protagonist was a good person, and hated it when others suffered because of him. However, he was cold with those who were his enemies, questioning if she was an enemy of the boy. Desperate, the woman says she was not. Arcia, in turn, says that then it was okay. About to leave the room, Adrian appears. Apologizing to the boy, she runs out of the room. Since that day, a rumor spread about Adrian never forgetting favors and intrigues, and that Arcia hated people who bothered him. One of the servants asks if they could really follow them to the castle. Adrian, confused, asks what he was talking about, mentioning that when the war was in full swing, besides leveling up, he had to discover talents with great potential using his magic glasses. The other guy says that Adrian wouldn't summon them for no reason because he should have a plan. But for the protagonist, he didn't know if he could call it that way because he had summoned them to gain a little more experience, mentioning that they would see many nobles in the castle, and if they were lucky, they might see the royal family, asking them to observe the people leading that country. Noticing the other boy's shyness, Adrian thinks that if he wanted to grow in the future, he should learn to be more confident. Then the servant says they had arrived at the teleportation gate. Entering the portal, they then teleport. In the other city, the boy is surprised by the view. The protagonist, in turn, thinks that they were finally there, the capital of the kingdom of Ranhart called Lionel. A crowd observes the protagonist, saying he was much more handsome in person. Then a noble appears, saying he could see that the two were very popular, mentioning that they had no idea how crazy he had been recently because of them. Adrian thinks it was as expected because the upper class didn't like that. Observing the man's stats, the protagonist is surprised because he had 4 high talents and a trait of an integral leader. Then the man apologizes to the protagonist for saying too much, but that wasn't what Adrian was talking about, asking the man to take it, handing him a card. Adrian says that when he had a territory, he was thinking of hiring a talented administrator to take care of it, and if he was interested, he should contact the protagonist because he was sure to guarantee the best treatment. Arriving at the location, the man says that only Mr. Lawrence and Mrs. McLean could enter that room, and the inspection lasted about 3 hours. Adrian asks the two to walk around and he would notify them when he was done. Then the man tells the boy to be careful, saying he didn't know what could happen inside, but the inspector didn't seem happy with him. Adrian thanks him for the information, saying that there was always the option to let his father go if something went wrong. Inside the room, a group of people was observing the protagonist. Adrian thinks he could see Walker's level of concern because of the 2 people in front of him. Greeting the man, he says it was an honor to meet the commander of the Royal Guard. Saying the protagonist could lift his head, the boy observes his stats, thinking his talents were high as expected from an Aura Master, and that he probably had an Aura Master as a teacher, taking all the elixirs and medicines like candy all the time. The man says he would investigate the situation, so Adrian says if that was what the nobles decided, it was fine, where that investigation would be conducted by Prince Luke. Seeing the other man's stats, he realizes he was uncomfortable because he asked the chief inspector to be sure, apologizing for the discourtesy because he ended up questioning his decision. Then the man asked him to sit down because the investigation was about to begin. Sometime later, there was nothing significant in the investigation, and even if there was something against Adrian, he had his alibi. Still in the discussion, the man says that if someone starts a war, that person should know there would be expected damages. And assuming that Viscount Lawrence completely destroyed Marcus Raven, Adrian thinks he was worried about their relationship being hostile, but he was a fair person. Continuing to speak, the man says that there was no other reason to continue the investigation. Meanwhile, Adrian notices the nobles talking about Marcus Raven. Seeing that, including Hamilton, most of the noble inspectors were aligned with the prince, and there were also some on the side of Marcus Raven, thinking that perhaps Prince Luke developed hostility towards him because of the influence of the people around him and not of his own will. The prince in turn calls the protagonist, saying he didn't like beating around the bush and would get straight to the point, mentioning that he was competing with his brother for the crown and the competition was quite even. But that changed when Adrian appeared, especially about Raven, who was one of his main influences. The boy apologizes to the prince, who says he didn't blame him because that incident was because of him. But if he had sided with his brother, it would have been worse for him. And that's why he asked him before his brother did. Adrian thinks that was the real reason he joined this investigation. The first prince was already the crown prince, but there was opposition to him because the second prince became an aura master. They were balanced, but thinking that the second prince went so far despite knowing that the first prince had the right of inheritance and status. Raven's strength was dissolved, however, it wasn't enough to cause a significant impact. The problem was that he and Arcia fell from the sky. Besides, they not only had individual skills, but also had funds. They were the great weight that could tip the balance, saying to the man that he didn't have enough to enter the political field, and above all, he hadn't even earned his title yet. The prince says that if he joined, he would give him the importance and status of an archmage, in addition to his recognition in the war. Adrian asks if that was really possible. The prince says it wasn't, but he could make it happen, mentioning that his territory seemed good. The protagonist says that the offer was very good, asking if he was worth all that. Luke responds that he was worth more than he thought and also had a beautiful aura master by his side. However, the boy says he should think about it for a while. The prince mentions that mages were known for being cautious, but to Adrian, he just didn't like his behavior. So the prince gives him a week to think about it, questioning if he didn't think the crown should belong to people with more skills. Adrian says he would reflect on those words. Then Luke calls Arcia, saying she was less than expected and was surprised she was an aura master, suggesting they duel sometime because she was the first female aura master he had met. The girl says it would be a pleasure. Luke mentions that she was quite cold and that they would meet next time. The other man next, the protagonist, whispers that he should stop thinking and accept the offer, because Luke wasn't used to being rejected by anyone. Adrian thinks he just stalled and was doing it as a formality. Asking if Arcia was hungry, the girl says she would like to eat now. Remembering his handshake with the prince, the boy feels uncomfortable, saying that trash had touched his hand, so he should wash it first before going to the restaurant. A man appears, saying he knew many restaurants. Observing the man, Adrian questions who that person could be. Looking at his stats, he realizes it was the first prince using a facial alteration spell to disguise himself. Moreover, his stats were extremely high. The prince then says they were really incredible because they recognized who he was and that spell didn't work on idiots like his brother. Adrian thinks he didn't seem like a first prince by the way he was acting. But the first thing that came to his mind was that he definitely couldn't make that person his enemy, asking if he could expect a luxurious dinner. The man responds yes, and that he would guide them to the place. The protagonist thinks his profile was very good for a human and his talents were focused on politics. However, considering all the talents, he was better than Arcia, because her talents weren't as high since they were focused on her sword skills. His mana was low, but he became a high mage with his intelligence. Noticing Adrian observing him, the prince says he seemed to have many questions. The boy says he was a more mysterious person than his younger brother. Then the three arrive at the place. Entering the room, the protagonist realizes it was a teleportation room, mentioning that he thought they couldn't use a teleportation spell inside the castle, but the prince asks if he didn't know, because there was an electric stone mine under the castle, sometimes conflicting with the mana, causing interruptions in the spells. Taking a control, the prince deactivates the shields surrounding that castle, leaving the boy surprised by that, affirming that he knew the first prince was an ordinary person from the beginning, questioning who that man in front of him really was. Entering the restaurant, the prince says they could now talk calmly. Then the prince remembers something, reactivating the castle's shield, leaving Adrian surprised because he was controlling the spell, mentioning that the second prince probably had no idea the first prince was playing security in the castle. Shaking the prince's hand, the protagonist says it was an honor to meet the crown prince. The prince in turn gives an order for the servants to prepare the food as he would have a meal with his guests. Meanwhile, Adrian thinks that people with high talents were walking around as if they were nothing, questioning if that was the crown prince's palace. Affirming, the prince mentions that the palace's chef was personally hired and he could guarantee that he was one of the best in the country, asking if the boy knew that he followed him on social media, showing his profile saying that was him. Mentioning that nobles didn't care much about social media, but the prince enjoyed it a lot. Michael van Reinhardt held the title of crown prince but treated him like a best friend, not seeming to fake it like the second prince. affirming that the two princes were completely opposite. Meanwhile, the two started discussing their social media. Then Adrian asks why he invited them to that place. The prince asks if he didn't know, and the boy responds that it was to recruit them. Affirming, Adrian asks what they could offer them. However, the prince says he had nothing to propose. The protagonist asks if he would promise benefits if he got the throne, responding yes, and he also wouldn't stop him from having the title of Viscount, mentioning that it wasn't something that could be easily given, and it seemed that Luke had promised that, but if the people on his side disagreed, they could prevent it. Adrian thinks the reason Van couldn't offer a title like Luke was because he knew it was an empty promise, and him saying he wouldn't be against the title of Viscount was basically saying he would help him get it while being on the second prince's side. Thinking about the proposal, the boy affirms it wasn't bad, and it was the decisive card of the game where whichever side he joined would have an advantage. Adrian in turn says he had more than one choice but only one answer, accepting the prince's offer, saying he would do as he wished. Van asks if he was sure and didn't need more time to think, but the boy was already confident that he deserved to be on the throne. The prince mentions that he couldn't say all that and then go to Luke's side, but to Adrian he couldn't betray a follower of his. Then Van asks Arcia whose side she was on. Hadrian, in turn, thinks his interest was different from the second prince's, which made him feel better. Arcia says that if the protagonist was comfortable with it, she would follow him. The protagonist affirms he already knew that, but even so, he feels uncomfortable when he speaks. Then Adrian says he had one last question, mentioning that he agreed to join Luke's side to get the title, but he didn't think he would find it strange if he didn't react. Responding, Van says he would oppose it at first and then give up after a while. However, the protagonist suggests taking something from him for letting him earn the title. Adrian thinks there was no reason to just give up without gaining anything in return, stating that Raven suffered a great loss by messing with him, losing 40% of his power by using his emotions while defending his territory, affirming that he didn't deserve the title of Marquis. Realizing what the boy was trying to say, he asks if it was to take the title of Marquis and give him the title of Viscount, saying that it seemed personal, but the protagonist doesn't deny it. Van asks what would happen if Luke rejected it, and Adrian says that promoting one of his own to Marquis would be good, mentioning that he had earned his title of Viscount by merit, and it would be a good move to promote one of his counts who also helped in the war. Observing the prince, he notices he was suspicious of that. So Van asks if he could say who he had met besides the second prince. Responding, he says that Walker had guided him and the others were the prince and Viscount Hamilton, besides the 6 inspectors in his interrogation, making a total of 9 people, questioning if he had done something wrong. Seeing his stats again, he notices he was confused and amazed. Adrian, in turn, says they were thinking the same, thinking he couldn't read minds but could guess from his glasses as he was confused because his plan was stated in front of him without mentioning it. The prince says he was also considering those two as part of his plan. Adrian says he had suggested a plan, but it was incredible that he thought the same. Van affirms that it allowed him to see his incredible decision-making, and reaching the 7th circle at only 20 years old was not for everyone, saying he really didn't want to be his enemy. Then the prince hands a phone to both of them so that no one could track them and would call if there was more to say, mentioning that today's meal was enjoyable. Teleporting the two, Van says they should meet later. After the teleportation, Arcia says they were in a warehouse near the entrance. Adrian thinks he was a very cautious person, calling Arcia to leave that place. At the same moment, the protagonist finds Billiam and the other boy, saying they were really having fun, questioning what they were hiding. Noticing they were buying various things with photos of the two, Adrian wonders why they were selling those things at the castle gate. Arcia, seeing the bags they were holding with their faces, asks if they were of Takis, but in reality, they were just admiring. The empire grew by 12% within a year, and the severe corruption made Ressus Island hesitant to introduce a republic. The hope of the freest republic was all in the hands of the legacy bearer, President's son Louis Fairmont. Many people question whether the legacy of Archmage Lucas had been acquired by the president's son. In the Brigham Empire Palace, a man asks if that legacy really fell into the hands of those without sense, because the legacy was supposed to be theirs since they were the homeland of Manuel Lucas. That man was the emperor named Edward. Telling his servants to say something. Apologizing, the king says it was very frustrating, asking another woman what she thought and if she believed they were telling the truth. But for her, it was in the middle ground, affirming that she had looked at the exploration progress and they were using an old method compared to theirs. The most important thing was that they had no idea about the main legacy, which had a ciphered text. However, they found the legacy without knowing that, which didn't make sense unless the clues weren't a trick. The emperor questions why he said it was middle ground even with so many suspicions. Responding, he says that if the Archmage's clues were a trick, maybe someone had already found the legacy and tricked the freest empire to distract others. But the emperor questions why, because that person could just hide, but she might have already exposed herself or something else they didn't know, affirming they had to look through all possibilities. And there were 4 possible nations that could do that: the Croizon Empire, Elysia, Lucius Kingdom, and the Ranhart Kingdom. The king mentions hearing that the Ranhart Kingdom was also making moves, and the woman says there was a young man who reached the 7th circle at 20 years old. However, he didn't have enough power to do all that. The Lucius kingdom accepted him as one of theirs. Many investigators testified that there was nothing wrong with the investments, and there was no evidence that he owned the legacy, leaving the emperor surprised because all that was done with his talent. But the woman says that a long time ago in their empire, there was another person more talented than him. The king says it's true, mentioning that the Reinhardt kingdom was having succession conflicts, and the woman says they could classify the suspects in the other empires. Then the emperor orders to increase surveillance on the royalty and nobles. Furthermore, he should send a warning to Frias because the Lucas legacy was their property, so they would consider their actions as theft. If they don't realize their position after this, the warning will become an ultimatum, and they will show the world who they are. With a threatening look, he says that destroying a country to obtain Lucas's legacy was a small price to pay. Then the king says he wants something else, giving the order to try to contact the young man from the kingdom of Reinhardt, because it was better to be a count in his empire than in the kingdom where he was. Meanwhile, a group of people said that Adrian had locked his brother and stepmother in the aerial fortress and killed them because they were bothering him, questioning if the rumors were true and why he watched his family's death like fireworks, leaving everyone in the room scared, thinking they should never have messed with the protagonist. One of the men asks if that meant he gathered 2 counts and a viscount for his main power, which was equivalent to the power of a marquis. Another woman mentions that Raven lost because he commanded his troops like an idiot, questioning if they thought he would lose in a face-to-face battle. Then everyone agrees with the girl. Continuing to speak, she says that just because they had some counts didn't mean he would take revenge on them, affirming that times have changed and there was no need to fear an archmage and an aura master. Even if it's just for now, his power was no different from that of a marquis, asking if they were underestimating themselves, and if they were afraid of Adrian, knowing that there were so many high-ranking nobles. Woman says she would leave the room, and the other guy asks why, saying they were just starting, mentioning that someone had traveled to Elysia and obtained a precious medicine. Then she says her father had called her, so she couldn't do anything about it, and the man asks her to return as soon as possible. Remembering her past, the girl observed the protagonist with radiant silver hair and blue eyes. Its appearance was notable even in the academy where many colleagues gathered. When they were teenagers, Adrian asks what she was doing, saying that Commoner had offended him, and no matter what they did, he never retaliated, asking if she wasn't honored to discover what happens if she offended an aristocrat. Adrian, in turn, tells her to wait for it, because he would torture her in the worst possible way, making her regret being born into that world. The girl thinks she always liked the protagonist a lot because of that pretty face with an angry expression. And what could a mere count without a political base achieve compared to her, who had dominated the social circle of the 6th Marcus family? Inside a house, that girl seemed surprised by what her father had said, for His Highness Luke had promised Lawrence the title of Marquis. This could make him a key power in that country in the future. The girl in turn is surprised because a Marquis title was suddenly given to the son of a concubine. She questions if that was even possible. However, the man says that Prince Luke believes Sir Lawrence was very capable of holding the title. Moreover, he became a 7th Circle mage at 20 years old and was very likely to reach the 8th Circle in the future. Adding to that the talented Grandmaster by his side, who was equivalent to an 8th Circle mage. His existence was crucial to maintaining the balance of power in his favor, so it wasn't bad to bring someone influential to his side. For this reason, he wanted to use his daughter to build a friendship with him. And of course, it would be even better if she could marry the protagonist. Desperate, the woman thought this was very bad, because Adrian had become the 6th Marquis of the city of Reinhardt. Count and Marquis were only 1 rank apart, but their political weight was on a different level. If things continued this way, it would become very bad, thinking she was completely wrong because those idiots around were useless. Meanwhile, Arcia had put on a white wig. She asked the protagonist if it looked good, and he quickly responded that it looked great. The first thing Adrian did when he returned to the palace was to play it off, since it would be problematic if someone was walking around with a celebrity. So a simple disguise for her wasn't so bad. Sometime later, a boy asked if the protagonist was planning to enter the military industry. Hearing what the boy had said, the Lord was surprised, questioning what kind of behavior that was in front of the protagonist. Observing the boy's statistics, the protagonist was surprised because he had 3 high abilities exactly like his father's. Adrian asked why he thought that, and the boy replied that steel manufacturing, among other things, didn't bring much profit in the short term, and it only drained money, which meant that the protagonist would eventually replace it. He didn't think the protagonist, who had made a fortune of trillions in investments, would make that judgment, so he thought that acquiring the company would be an investment in the future. Adrian, hearing what the boy had said, mentioned that was exactly it, but his potentials were limited. Thinking about this, he believed the military area would end up being a great investment. Curious, the boy asked if he could know more about what the protagonist had in mind, because he thought it was necessary to keep in mind what to prioritize to better follow his orders in the future. So the protagonist just gave a side smile, mentioning that they would start with the Vanguard equipment, because it had the principle of the Force system, and the method of producing the equipment was rudimentary, and if they had the assistance, they should understand it well. Currently, the production of Vanguard equipment is shared among 3 families in that kingdom. In other words, the Vanguard equipment was being manufactured by the most powerful in the kingdom. In short, being able to produce that equipment meant they could match them. The boy said that way the current power wouldn't stand still. Adrian said everything would be fine since he thought about how to respond after visiting the royal palace. Vanguard equipment wasn't something just anyone could produce, no matter how big they were. So the question arose whether a 20-year-old mage appearing out of nowhere could make that kind of equipment. For this reason, it was as if he was asking to attract public attention, saying he wouldn't be satisfied with just the Vanguard equipment, asking them to inform him when they had a good magic tower available. Hearing the protagonist's reasoning, the two were surprised because they assumed he was aiming to make an aerial fortress. They mentioned they would do their best. Meanwhile, the protagonist's father seemed somewhat worn out. Arcia said that Adrian had accepted the second prince's proposal because there was no other reason to refuse. Rayford said nothing had gone as expected since he returned from the war, and his mother said she was worried because her son was going to become a noble, questioning if everything was alright. Adrian asked if being a Marquis was a big deal because he needed to be a king of the country and build a harem to be satisfied. Hearing what the protagonist had said, his parents were completely surprised, because he was saying that kind of thing in front of his love. Adrian said it was just a joke, and his father asked if he didn't have better things to do. Looking at Arcia, it was clear that it hadn't just been a joke. However, when he looks again, the protagonist realizes that her status had returned to normal. His mother, apparently irritated, tells him to be kind to Arcia and not to do anything unnecessary. Adrian mentions that they would have an important commission soon, so he wanted to finish the work they had been delaying to mark a new beginning for the family. It wasn't a big deal because punishing the servants who had hurt his mother, among others, was nothing out of the ordinary. Therefore, they had to annihilate them from the inside and out. Meanwhile, in a room, a group of nobles seems to be discussing the protagonist becoming a Marquis. His son mentions that many fathers would try and get close to him because they coveted his talents, and treating him lightly was like abandoning a competent young man who would lead his kingdom. Another prince says that, as far as he knew, there hadn't been anyone like him for at least 200 years. Annoyed, another prince asks if his words hadn't crossed the line. The prince asks why there should be formality between them, as he thought it would ease something that could benefit him. Another prince questions what he had said because he wanted him to understand how inappropriate his comment had been as a crown prince. However, if he accepted his conditions, he would end up accepting his argument. He asked to let Marquis Raven have his position as Marquis demoted. The boy questions if he was suggesting choosing between old influence and new influence. And the prince says it wasn't a bad suggestion because he would continue to be a noble like a count and wouldn't have anything more added as a Marquis. However, the prince doesn't agree with that because it was like doing something despicable like risking his life. The prince assumes it was as he thought, having refused because his personality wouldn't let him accept it, saying that if that were the case, he would make a new proposal. And he hoped that Count Otis, who had made a great contribution as Lawrence's superior during the war, would be appointed as the new Marquis. Admitting that Lawrence made great contributions in this war, but it wasn't an exaggeration to say that half of the credit belonged to that man. And this was a suggestion to accept the meaningless proposal of giving a title like Marquis and gloss over Marquis Raven's mistakes. The king, in turn, asked them to stop fighting at once, for his jury had already been decided, and they would accept the requests of the Crown Prince and Prince Luke. A few days later, the protagonist's mother is surprised because they were at the palace. His mother, in turn, asked if she didn't look ugly, and the protagonist asked her not to worry about that. For many sons of famous nobles would ask for a dance without knowing she was a noble's wife. The mother, in turn, mentions that she thought Arcia would look very beautiful in a dress like that, and Arcia responds that she quite liked that style. Looking to the side, the protagonist seems to notice something. And a group of people seems to recognize the protagonist. One of them was a noble named Dorothy. The other was also a noble named Parma, and the girl, also a noble, was named Karma. Lastly, the other was named Ronir, thinking that they were faces he had missed, asking if they still walked together even after they had grown up, asking where their master had gone. Saying goodbye, he mentions that he would visit them later when he had time, and then they could talk a lot. Observing the group, his mother asks if they were his friends, and the protagonist replies that they were his academy classmates. The other man asks if they had seen the look on that woman's face when she said goodbye because it looked like she wanted to kill him. But it would be fine because an aristocrat couldn't do anything. Observing the group, Arcia asks if she should kill them, and the protagonist says not yet, for he had made a promise to them before. A butler appears, welcoming the Lawrence family because he would show them to their seats. Then a woman appears, asking if they weren't the Viscounts Lawrence. Several people begin to greet the protagonist's mother. Adrian thinks that all the high-ranking nobles were aware of the news of his new title. Noticing something, he seems surprised. Looking around, he seems to spot someone he knew. For Marquis Raven was also nearby, thinking he must have gotten an earful from the second prince, seeing how he was trying to keep his distance secretly. Thus, the celebration was about to begin, and the king announces that Count Otis would be the new Marquis of that state. Adrian, in turn, is happy because, thank God, that man was on the crown prince's side. The man beside the prince was definitely the most famous swordsman in the kingdom, named Vicente. And it seemed that the aura masters of that country were very interested in Arcia. As expected, she didn't match with the second prince. Soon after, the king calls Arcia's name along with the protagonists, asking both to kneel. The title of Marquez would be given to the protagonist, along with the area of Markov as his territory, and to Arcia and the title of Countess in the area of Glendale as her territory. Additionally, each of the two new owners would be granted a fortress. The king expected both of them to do their best in defending their country. Both of them thanked the king for his generous offer, and everyone around was surprised by the Marquess title given to the protagonist. The king asked if the protagonist had anything to say. Adrian began to rise, saying that first and foremost, he was at the mercy of His Majesty in his heart and in the justice of that country. He dared to thank the Crown Prince and Prince Luke, but there was something he wanted to do immediately after becoming an aristocrat concerning the territory, and he wished to clarify his desire in front of everyone present. He began mentioning the names of all those boys from earlier, declaring war against the territory of those 4 families, leaving everyone around completely shocked by what the protagonist had said. Calitz Reinhardt was the king of the Reinhardt Kingdom. He had a growing concern in recent days, which was the problem of the successor divided between the crown prince and the second prince. Hearing what Adrian had said, the king thought he already had enough of a headache because of his sons. But still, a new lumetic had appeared in that country. The prince said he must have misunderstood the tendencies of Marcus Lawrence because he thought he was a typical scholar. But he never thought he would be so aggressive. He knew that the new lord couldn't expand his territory for a year. So the protagonist asked if he should simply destroy those 4 families and return their territory to the royal decree. However, the protagonist decided to plan to go all the way. The prince, thinking that trying to stop him wouldn't work, said that his attitude had already disappointed him, so he would wait and see what would happen. Watching the prince leave, Adrian thought he expected that kind of reaction. Leaving that room, he noticed that the party had already started, and Arcia mentioned that she had been waiting for him. Before the event began, everyone was greeting them and saying they wanted to be their friends. However, now no one approached them, saying it seemed as though he was a scoundrel of the family. However, his father quickly responded that he was exactly that. Adrian said he didn't plan to go that far, but got carried away and apologized for what he had done. Rayford mentioned that he had just started a territorial war, questioning why he had done that. He responded that it was simply due to his revenge. Rayford said that fighting 4 families at the same time would be dangerous. However, Adrian asked him not to worry. Hearing his son's words, Rayford began to calm down, saying that he believed in him. And it had been a long time since he attended a party given by the royal family, so he would enjoy it. He asked his wife not to worry and to believe in their talented son. Watching the two, Adrian thought he had been walking on eggshells in front of Anna all this time. But now he would take full care of his mother. So now he should continue what they were doing. Meanwhile, that group from before was discussing what the protagonist had done, considering the possibility that they might end up losing their territories. And looking at his declaration of war, the 4 families should unite. The other boy asked everyone to calm down because no matter how small they were compared to Isabella or Sora from families like a Viscounty, and by combining the power of these families, it would be enough to deal with a newly designated Marquess. Hearing what the boy had said, everyone seemed to agree. The other girls said that it was certainly plausible, and the protagonist quickly appeared behind her, questioning if that was true, greeting everyone around, getting irritated because everyone was calling him by his name. So he should make them respect him, throwing his glove in the other boy's face, mentioning that he couldn't stand such rudeness and would therefore challenge him to a duel. Then another person appeared, seemingly disagreeing with that duel, because Adrian had provoked them before, and besides, there was a big difference between the two, so the duel couldn't be established according to national laws. Adrian said it was a pity because if he had let him cut off his son's head, he would keep his territory out of the war. The man said he didn't know the unfortunate relationship he had with his son, but he didn't think he could be going too far. However, to the protagonist, that was nothing because he was someone with well-defined relationships, and if something was lost, it should be paid for. His father asking what that meant, and the protagonist responds that he could ask his son for the details. Additionally, the declaration of war should arrive within a week unless he didn't want his family to fall because of his son. Meanwhile, that girl from earlier was observing the situation from the background. As he started to leave, the protagonist said he would see him on the battlefield. Irritated, the other boy's father said they would talk later. Sometime later, news about the wars that were going to be waged against the protagonist began to surface. There were no secrets in that world, and it ended up spreading even without media coverage. With that, there would be no issues with justifications for war. Another man, continuing to speak, mentioned that they were providing information on the explanations for the floating fortress that could be sent immediately. Showing the paper, he said that it was the catalog of the fortresses. People looked at the protagonist, saying he was irresponsible. Additionally, there was illogical to fight a territorial war when he didn't even have proper military power. But it was obvious they were wrong about something. For if they were without military power, they should simply buy a little more, mentioning that they would buy all those towers listed in the catalog, thinking that now he had 48 trillion stored in his vault. and if he added everything he had gained from the war, it would easily reach 70 trillion. The man said that the transaction amount was so large that half should be paid in advance, but the protagonist said that he had paid many taxes recently and therefore wanted to have an exemption. Seeming to reach an agreement, the man thanked him for the purchase, thinking that the deal didn't even seem real. Noticing something, the protagonist seemed surprised, realizing that Marquis Otis was also there, asking the man to speak calmly because they had gone to the battlefield together. While they were talking, the man seemed to notice something. For if the protagonist was there, it meant he had done something, and the boy responded that he had just bought all the floating fortresses. Shaken, the man said he had no choice but to make a reservation. Adrian thought that, as expected, now that he had become a marquis, the power restrictions were much less for him, so he should be there trying to buy more additional fortresses. Otis said that it was the first time seeing that girl, mentioning that she was the daughter he had mentioned before. The girl in turn said it was a pleasure to meet the protagonist, mentioning that her name was Michelle. Adrian also introduced himself and introduced Arcia, mentioning that she was his fiancée. Observing the woman, he thought that according to the rumors, she was a lunatic with a bad reputation. However, she didn't seem like that at all. Surprised because one of her traits was English interpretation, because she knew the language from her previous life. The man mentioned that until recently, she was very busy trying to take care of the Archduke Lucas's fate. But as he should also know, she appeared in the Prius Republic, entering into despair because of that, and now he was taking her around with him. Adrian thought that the person who was searching for the Archduke's fate had a trait of English interpretation, and if he hadn't had the cheat of being born on Earth, he might have been able to get his hands on the fate before him. Saying that was very interesting, he then wanted to say that the fate found in the Republic was actually false. The woman mentioned that the fate existed but was hidden somewhere secret, and it wasn't something they could find in that place. The details were secret, but you could say that it was a difficult place to find if one was a noble. Adrian thought that certainly, nobles usually thought of Hollywood, the virtual reality system, as a place for commoners to escape from reality and fantasies. As a result, it naturally became a place difficult for nobles to find. Questioning who that girl was because he thought she was just making some random prediction. However, she was very close to achieving the fate if it weren't for the protagonist. The woman said that unlike her father, she had decided to go because of her bloodline and not because of her abilities. That's why she liked people who grew by themselves, and she would love to talk with her at another time. Questioning what the man thought of her, to which he simply responded with a smile, saying that he would love that, so he would send an invitation as soon as possible. Arcia, in turn, asked if she should kill the girl, and the protagonist simply said they should observe her a bit more, supposing they should keep an eye on her for some time. Meanwhile, a group of people was discussing the exorbitant purchase the protagonist had made. The man asked if that brat was really thinking of waging a war to spend 70 trillion on weapons in just one day. The other man mentioned that it was actually 140 trillion since 70 had been paid up front, and the remainder would be paid in installments. Another young man remarked that he had taken the situation lightly, but even if he had bought all those weapons, they would still be useless if no one used them. After all, Adrian was still a new lord and shouldn't have a proper cavalry. The other woman asked if anything had gone as expected since he had appeared. He was someone for whom common sense shouldn't even be applied, as they couldn't treat him like someone who was about to become an archmage. It would be better to keep the worst-case scenario in mind since they couldn't run around in confusion all the time. Another young man said that Marquis Lawrence should be honored with his title because he posted a job opening for knights in the daily paper. It received over 4,000 comments from people saying they wanted to work with him. However, the Marquis had acquired a magic tower and an artifact production company today, so it would be impossible for him to use the technical mages he had there. In a territorial war for land acquisition, they might fight against the maximum power a Marquis could have. That family was truly terrifying. As a result, a unilateral massacre could end up happening. Another man asked if that war wasn't between the Marquis and the other four families, and if they brought in the surrounding territories, they could gain more allies. Irritated, the man asked another butler to bring the protagonist there to find out why all of this was happening. Meanwhile, the protagonist seemed to be enjoying the view. He remarked that everything seemed very new, but when he looked down, the gigantic city truly made him feel like a great lord. Another man asked what he thought of the newly formed knight troop. Looking to the side, he noticed that the man had arrived, mentioning that it was done at the last minute but was still very good. Pleased, the man said it was as expected from that family, as they had good discernment. The other woman said that the protagonist really had sovereignty many times over. He had brought in many military supplies, including fortresses and vanguard equipment a few days ago, and now had prepared the knights in advance. However, for the young man, he just got lucky with that. Feeling embarrassed by all the praise they were giving him, he thought that he had only done the outline but didn't need to say that things really turned out right, asking what they thought of the knights since they could send them to the territorial war right away. The man agreed with that because he had chosen some with good experience, so there shouldn't be any problem. Observing the towers, he thought that if they were going to deliver them to him, they should have given him the latest generation, questioning why they delivered those outdated ones. But since they were gifts from the royalty, he couldn't simply discard them, mentioning that since there wouldn't be any problems from that day on, they would go directly to the battlefield. ordering them to finish the preparations and within 3 hours divide them into 4 groups as they would close off the territory to prevent the forces from joining. The man was about to say that they needed the royal family's permission, but the protagonist said it was just a matter of whether it would be quick or not. And anyway, the permission would come eventually, and until then, they would call it training. At that moment, Adrian wouldn't be giving orders from a safe place, but would go directly to the battlefield with Arcia, showing his military power without any hesitation. Reflecting on all of his past experiences, the protagonist thought about how far he had come, and that now they would march to the battlefield. Meanwhile, somewhere else, a woman said that this was very problematic because His Majesty had granted Adrian a title, and the Emperor wanted her to recruit the protagonist, questioning who would have thought they would move so quickly. Moreover, as soon as he received the title, he requested a territorial war with the 4 viscounties simultaneously, so they would soon find out if he was a lunatic without a plan or an eccentric person with something in mind. Then another woman appeared, saying she didn't know there would be other visitors. Observing the girl, she seemed to recognize her, whose name was Olivia Riverdale. Meanwhile, the protagonist seemed pleased with something, and 3 people were standing in front of him. They mentioned that they were aware that permission for the territorial war had not yet been granted, but he still placed his troops in front of their viscounty, questioning if he was really ignoring the law. However, the protagonist said they were completely mistaken, as they were only doing a mere training exercise, asking if they had attacked their viscounty. When they responded that they hadn't, the protagonist asked them not to worry because he was also a person who upheld the law. So he wouldn't attack until permission was granted, and if they didn't mind, they should continue with their work. The man, in turn, asked if they would attack immediately once the permission was granted, and Adrian replied, of course. For now, his army was just training in front of them. The man pointed out that the permission for the territorial war hadn't even been granted yet, questioning if it was really plausible to start a war over a school-era dispute from their school days. Saying yes, the protagonist seemed to use magic on the 3 of them. At that very moment, someone seemed to contact the boy via his watch, mentioning that the permission for the territorial war had been granted. Observing the situation, the protagonist appeared pleased, remarking that it seemed the royal family had a different opinion than his, so they must have decided based on who was more valuable to them. Desperate, the man pleaded for a rational decision, and the protagonist asked him to leave because from now on, the person he had to convince was not him, but Viscount Parma. And the only way for his territory to survive was to surrender. There was no other way to avoid that war. Shortly after, a teleportation interference spell began to be cast. Thus, the floating fortresses began to move, with the objective being the fall of Viscount Parma. Adrian ordered everyone to march toward their target. Adrian then asked the man if he wasn't going to return because at that moment there wasn't much time left. Quickly, the boy began to leave the room. Meanwhile, Adrian took Arcia's hand, saying that from now on the 2 of them would join the front lines directly. During this time, he would leave command to Perseus. As he tried to question his leader's reasoning for that movement, the protagonist quickly began to leave the room. Meanwhile, a voice spoke saying that Adrian, along with Arcia, had gone directly to the front lines so they should protect them immediately. Adrian recalled that someone had once told him that even after achieving revenge, nothing but a sense of futility would remain. And in the end, revenge only begets more revenge. However, he had a different opinion because nothing gives a greater sense of purpose than seeking revenge. Anna, along with Cedric and even the villains from the Academy, the eradication of their existences could be described as the starting point for his new future. Moreover, there was something much more satisfying than that, as it was very interesting to see his enemies screaming with their twisted faces. Meanwhile, someone was crying, questioning the reason for the explosion and whether the protagonist had gone mad because he really shot at them. The boy, in turn, asked what the probability of winning that war was, and the man responded that their military strength was twice as large as theirs. Moreover, there was an aura master, so their chances were nearly 0, leaving the boy completely shaken by that. The servant in turn mentioned that even in a situation like that, the boy was still only thinking about himself, saying that he would give him some advice on what to do in that situation, because he should go to the Marquess and die at their hands to save his entire country. Thus, the damage to the territory would be much less. Moreover, everyone in the castle probably thought the same thing, for he had always been cruel, but no one understood why they were facing the danger of dying, because when those people below them died, they would probably blame him instead of the protagonist. And more than 10 people had already died directly or indirectly because of his actions. And in the end, they finally understood what the phrase, "you reap what you sow," meant. Even with all that, the boy didn't seem to agree with any of it, saying that the protagonist was more than just abnormal. Then the commander appeared. The boy asked him to come closer and take him out of that place, suggesting they ask for help from other territories. Looking down, the boy noticed a piece of Vanguard equipment, questioning why it was on the ground. The man, in turn, told the boy to put it on and challenge Lawrence to a face-to-face fight, for that was an order from the Viscount. Then those men seemed to forcefully dress the boy in that outfit. Meanwhile, the boy remembered those words from when the protagonist was a child, saying that he would make him regret being born into this world, thinking that it had indeed come true. Sometime later, the boy seemed to have already put on that armor, and the other man said there was no reason for him to despair, For even if Marcos Lawrence was an archmage, he was still a mage, and a warrior armed with force equipment should be able to handle him. The desperate boy asked if he found that comforting. Saying no, the man mentioned that he was just helping him survive. And even if he hid in that way, there would only be one outcome, and he was merely becoming an offering for his revenge. The man then asked what would happen if he used the vanguard equipment while Adrian had his guard down, attacking the Marquis and ultimately defeating him. Adrian didn't have a wife or successor, so the territorial war would end at that moment with his victory. In other words, the boy would become the hero of the Viscounty. Motivated, the boy said he would survive, eliminate the still-living protagonist, and then make them all pay for it. The man responded that if he managed to defeat the Marquis, they would gladly accept their punishment. Driven by motivation, the boy seemed to head directly to the battlefield, thinking that the vanguard equipment, with its powerful attack and defense, didn't get its name for nothing, only to be destroyed by a mage. And if Adrian lowered his guard, the possibility of a miracle happening was very high. At that moment, when he stepped outside, a massive battle was taking place. Desperate, the boy seemed to notice something because the protagonist was in front of his troops, easily taking them down. He questioned if that was the power of an archmage and an aura master, telling the commander that it was a joke if he expected him to go into that place because there was absolutely no way to win against those monsters. Meanwhile, several armed people rushed at the protagonist, who easily defeated them all at once. Observing the situation, the boy became completely desperate as he saw several towers hovering above his home. Those were numerous floating fortresses that seemed to be dropping more soldiers. Then Adrian noticed the boy, mentioning that he thought the boy would be hiding rather than coming straight to the battlefield, so this was very unexpected. Shortly after, the boy was pushed by one of the soldiers, ordered to go defeat the protagonist. Then the boy seemed to challenge the protagonist to a duel, which surprised Adrian with what the boy had said. And if he was a noble who valued honor, he certainly wouldn't ignore that. Snapping his fingers, the protagonist questioned what he was talking about, and in a matter of seconds, he launched an attack beside him, which resulted in injuring the boy's arm slightly. The boy, in desperation, thought he was about to meet Hades much sooner than expected. Adrian mentioned that he had spent 70 million on installations to buy weapons and felt like he could erase his life quickly. And since there were vanguard equipment pieces scattered all around, it was like a floating offering to the fortress, questioning if the boy knew what was best. For he still had his family's treasure. Irritated, the boy asked if that was the protagonist's goal, to which Adrian replied that it was part of it, but he had come mainly for his revenge. Grabbing a staff, Adrian advanced toward the boy, showing the parts where he had broken them, mentioning that the boy and his group had mentally tormented him to the point of making him angry, and for that, they would meet Jesus sooner. Then the boy seemed to use a healing spell, saying it wouldn't be as fun if he died from blood loss, ordering the soldiers to take care of him and commanding the group to escort him to the Lord's office. 30 minutes later, the war between Marcos Lawrence and Viscount Parma had ended. Meanwhile, a teleportation interference spell was cast, and as a result, the war had begun, and those two girls were watching the battle to see how good the protagonist was, being surprised by what they had seen, because a mage was simply fighting at close range. The main reason mages were limited on modern battlefields wasn't because of compatibility with the Vanguard, but rather due to a teleportation interference spell, a short-range movement spell that could increase the mage's survival and mobility, which was relatively slower. And as the best technique to counter this, the interference spell had become quite common, so the spell could no longer be used on the battlefield. As a result, mages nowadays didn't participate much on the front lines. However, Marcos Lawrence's fight was completely different because he could basically dodge attacks even without using teleportation, questioning the woman if she thought that was really possible. She replied that even with various support spells, it would be extremely difficult and it required a lot of physical combat experience along with battle sense, so it wasn't something just anyone could achieve. Continuing to observe the boy, the woman mentioned that she had admired him, but now she should leave. Recalling the protagonist's words, the woman thought that he had shown many unique habits from his school while casting those spells, so she shouldn't have doubted him, but she ended up seeing a show thanks to the protagonist. Meanwhile, that man seemed to lead the protagonist to the Lord's office. At that very moment, an explosion occurred, and Adrian entered the room. The man inside was shocked by the protagonist's presence so quickly. Desperate, he ordered Adrian not to come any closer, but completely shaken, he ended up collapsing to the ground. Adrian then asked why he hadn't signed the document of surrender, and the young man asked what he would do with his family. The young man said that he wouldn't kill anyone except the main culprit, and in return, they would become a fallen, noble family that had their property and titles stripped away. Moreover, they would have the second option, to die if they so wished. With tears in his eyes, the young man said he would sign the document. Thus, when the Viscounty collapsed in the war between Marcos Lawrence and the four Viscounts, everyone knew that the war was practically over. Meanwhile, another man was desperate because the protagonist had occupied Viscount Parma's territory and was heading toward his own. To avoid a similar fate, the young man suggested handing over his children, who were entirely to blame for the situation. However, it was to no avail. As for Adrian, revenge was merely a justification for war from the beginning. and it was obvious that it was to increase his treasures while building an army. Thus, Adrian was planning to pass his leisure expenses onto them. For this reason, it was clear that they wouldn't be able to win the war, so they needed to change their methods. Meanwhile, several vanguard groups seemed to arrive at a specific teleportation site, and a man reported that Dorothy's vanguard had just entered the teleportation area. The teleportation would be done at 12:10, Rondel time. There was a race against time, and the march would be empty at that very moment, so they should take advantage of it to capture the march facilities along with the hostages. If that operation succeeded, the course of the war would change in an instant, thus they had to achieve it at any cost. Grabbing the teleportation scrolls, they seemed to do a countdown, and when it hit 0, it tore the paper, which consequently teleported them all to a city. Thus, the operation had begun, and Adrian had prepared a ceremony to welcome them all. While that group was falling through the air, a flying ship appeared, and it was the protagonist along with his colleagues. Desperate, the group realized that their operation had been discovered, and within seconds they were teleported to a different place. In front of them, several vanguard soldiers surrounded them. Looking up, they saw several floating fortresses. They were now completely surrounded with no way out. Above them, Adrian appeared, descending and asking them to lay down their arms and surrender, as that might be their only chance to stay alive. The man, still motivated, said that the war would end if they managed to capture Marcus Lawrence. Within seconds, Arcia appeared to protect him, and at the same moment, several vanguard teams advanced toward the boy, who, in response, began casting various spells attacking all the vanguard soldiers. For that reason, it was they who should surrender, because the reason they didn't consider this situation was that it wasn't even worth it. Seeming to use the spell, several explosions began happening around them. Another man ordered to kill the protagonist instead of capturing him, as the territorial war would end right then. Once again, Adrian seemed to use the same flame ability. Desperate, the man thought he wouldn't be able to dodge it, so he would have to stop it with the strength of his sword, attempting to use a shadow slash, which however didn't seem to have much effect. But even so, he managed to survive. At that moment, Adrian advanced toward the man, telling him not to get any closer, but Adrian easily dodged the attacks. The man, surprised, thought that he was making the aura force of a vanguard equipment ricochet, questioning how a mage could be like that. Quickly, the protagonist finished off the man. Sometime later, Adrian was calmly resting, observing the news and noticing that there were several articles about the war, but it had already ended some time ago. The last battle was a solo operation, and the Viscounts had no chance of winning, so he was able to capture the remaining castles quickly. All of his soldiers were astonished by the protagonist's competence. Then Arcia appeared, saying she was hungry and wanted to eat some cake. Observing the commotion, the protagonist thought it was very noisy, and it seemed that the girl had adapted well to become a good servant. A flashback of that girl from a few days earlier appeared, with several people telling her they were wrong, begging her to save them. The protagonist mentioned that those were the 4 people who had tormented them to death in the past, especially her, who was so hurt and had to leave just because she spoke to him about being bullied. Recalling those memories from the past, the girl becomes completely desperate. Adrian says that for political reasons, he needed some time, but he intended to make all those people apologize to her. However, the girl says there was no need to do all that for her. The boy responds that she may not realize it, but she was his savior, so they should continue smiling from that day on. Shortly after, the protagonist brings the girl back to the present, asking how she's been doing these days. With a smile, she mentions that every day has been very happy. Adrian is pleased with the girl's words. Sometime later, that prince was talking with the protagonist, mentioning that it was a true masterstroke to bring him to his side, because the disappearance of the 3 families that supported the second prince had a favorable outcome for him, so he was completely flattered. Jane says that in the process, a family that supported the crown prince was also erased. The prince says there was nothing to be done, as they sinned against the protagonist, and therefore they should pay the rightful price. He asks if Prince Luke hadn't said anything, and Adrian responds that he was quite bitter about it, as he asked if it was necessary to go so far, even if it was for revenge. Moreover, his men committed the same mistakes as the 4 Viscounts. And also Marcus Raven, who was his arch-enemy, should have been guilty too, but he had to hold back for the second prince's safety. After a moment of silence, he said he would let it go. The prince comments that, in any case, this further closed the gap with the second prince's faction. However, he didn't want a victory like that, he wanted a devastating victory, questioning if the civil war wasn't destroying the life of a country. Adrian thinks that surely the national power remains stable because of the civil war, and the empire's enemy could show its ambitions again. And that's why his betrayal was planned and the crown prince's complete victory was near. No matter how, politics is a fight between big dogs biting each other, as his strategy based on betrayal induces anxiety, questioning when he should proceed with the mission. However, the prince says they still need time, asking if there's any problem with that. He mentioned that the second prince continues to flirt with Arcia, so if it continues at this pace, it could end up causing confusion. Shaken, the prince says he wanted to apologize because of his brother, as his confidence has become a bit exaggerated since he became an aura master. Thus, he tends to think that any woman will be left in awe if he tries to seduce her. Then the prince seems to want to say something, asking if Adrian had any desire to hold a ceremony. Nervously, Adrian asks if he was talking about a wedding. Sometime later, the protagonist was walking toward the castle, thinking about the possibility of that marriage. It was indeed the best option, but it wasn't something he could decide so easily, as Arcia and he were superficial lovers, not true lovers. Moreover, she was one of Archduke Lucas's legacies, and he was sure she wouldn't accept his decision without complaint. But just because she was created for him didn't mean he couldn't use her as he wished. Shortly after, the boy meets Arcia. Observing several soldiers lying on the ground, he asks what that was all about, and the girl says she had taught them a lesson. Then that girl from earlier appears, mentioning that the second prince had sent someone. Arcia says that the second prince's gaze was very arrogant, so she didn't want to get involved with him in any way. Then the man sent by the prince appears. Introducing himself to the protagonist, he asks why he was there. Adrian orders the young man to get straight to the point, mentioning that Luke had invited that girl for a meal. Additionally, he had sent those flowers. Observing the situation, the protagonist becomes completely irritated, throwing the flowers away. Asking if that was all, the man replies that he would be grateful if Adrian gave a response to the invitation. Moreover, Luke hadn't invited Adrian, only the girl. Arcia quickly responds that she wouldn't go, and the man asks her not to act that way. Adrian asks which family that young man was from, as he had heard that to become a royal knight, one needed some kind of support. Additionally, he enjoyed destroying families to pieces, asking if the young man hadn't seen the previous news. Even so, he couldn't just blow his head off, even if the young man was the second prince's messenger. However, he wondered if he could do that in place of the young man's parents. The man responds that it was very rude of Adrian, as he had come there by His Highness's orders. However, the protagonist was offended, questioning whether he should put him in his place. And from now on, he wouldn't stand idle if someone came with an unpleasant offer. Therefore, he should return to His Highness and deliver the message as he was instructed, as he hoped their relationship would continue to be good. However, if provoked further, he would do something crazy. Additionally, it should be clear that that woman was his fiancée. Irritated, the second prince questioned if the protagonist had really said that. Shaken, the young man said that Adrian didn't seem to be joking just by the look in his eyes. The prince said he didn't think the Marquis was that kind of man, but had misinterpreted the invitation. His butler said it seemed like it was time to back off because provoking Adrian wouldn't be very wise. The prince then questioned if he really wanted that woman, as it would be better to take her once he assumed the throne. Hearing his butler's idea, he thought it was indeed a good one. So he would certainly teach the protagonist a lesson when the time came. However, the time was not right yet, and now he had one more reason to claim the throne. Meanwhile, Adrian was calmly resting, analyzing his balance of 42 trillion won, saying that now everything was finally over. Not just the money from the 4 viscounts who lost their territories in the war, but also various mana stones, along with jewels, precious metals, and so on. Anything worth more than a cent had been looted. Therefore, robbing the belongings of his enemies and enjoying their wealth was very satisfying. Picking something up, the protagonist seemed happy, observing that relic, which he believed to be the hilt of a sword used by the Celestials of the Mythic era, mentioning that anyone could tell it wasn't an ordinary item. Additionally, he had received a rare mineral that is produced in minimal quantities, and even one of those was worth more than a celestial fortress. Therefore, he was thinking of visiting the Holy Land, wondering if he should take a look at it. However, there was still one urgent thing he had to do. Sometime later, Arcia was already in that game from before, in the middle of a battle. Casting a spell, the protagonist mentioned that the boss looked a lot like the second prince, executing a sequence of attacks along with his group, which easily managed to eradicate that boss. Thinking that he couldn't leave that place abandoned, he had been so busy with work lately that he could only play for at least 3 hours a day. And thanks to that, he barely reached level 205. So he decided to focus on leveling up from that moment on. First, he left his matters that didn't require his advisor's presence, and to recruit talents, gave Arcia a pair of glasses in real life, making her proceed with it while he played. With that boost, he could level up as quickly as possible and reach the 8th circle. Meanwhile, Arcia mentioned that she had discovered a high-level talent. The protagonist asked to recruit him immediately. Arcia said she would leave the negotiations to the attendants, mentioning that the high-level talent was of divine power. Additionally, she had a unique nature characteristic of a saint. He was completely surprised by the abilities she had mentioned. Sometime later, Arcia was still in the real world and seemed to be recruiting that girl. Inside a market, the girl asked if they needed anything. Meanwhile, Arcia was still observing her characteristics. Only one god and one religion existed in the country of Rondel, which worshipped the creator of that world, an entity known as a single god named Sepia, and the doctrine of that god was called Serpianism. The headquarters of Serpianism and the place where the command is located are called the Holy Land, and it was so famous that even the Bringmo territory wouldn't dare invade it. Additionally, there were 3 lords of the Sacred War. The Sacred King took care of the church's general administration, the saint managed the army including the Sacred Knights, while the Saintess took care of all the priests, forming the divine military in the world. As they walked, the protagonist questioned where that girl was, and Arcia responded that Eric had taken her to the Talon Hall. Sometime later, the boy ended up finding her, who quickly distanced herself from the protagonist. Adrian, welcoming her, introduced himself to the girl, observing her stats and thinking that she truly had the nature of a saint. Arshia had said she found her working part-time at a convenience store due to her family's conditions, mentioning that the girl had chosen her well. Sometime later, the four of them were sitting on a sofa discussing something. Adrian said that she had mentioned her dream was to become an administrative officer, but unfortunately, her talents didn't fit into the administrative field. However, she had the talent of divine power, and her nature was so incredible that she could even aim for the position of a saintess. But of course, she couldn't become a saint just because she had immense potential, because the sacred king who received the blessing of the one god Sepia was chosen from the royal family by blood. But the saint and the saintess are chosen by God every 50 years regardless of their position. Because in the competition to choose the saintess, one must perform well and stand out before God. And since God had sent such a talent to him, he shouldn't just stand idly by. Therefore, he researched and discovered that the competition to elect a new saint and saintess would be held soon. So he planned to give all of his support for the young lady to become a saintess. Desperate, the girl asked if such a feat was really possible. And the protagonist responded that 7 out of 10 saints and saintesses were just ordinary citizens, so it wasn't impossible. However, it didn't happen overnight, so it required a lot of effort and determination on her part. And before the competition, she would have to learn many things, including etiquette, technology, and much more. For now, he was thinking of giving her a payment of 200 million along with a monthly salary of 500 million, thinking that it wouldn't be a waste even if he gave 10 or 100 times that amount. Because if he could win a saintess with his own hands, that alone would give him great power. He asked the girl not to think too much about it, as this wasn't just an administrative transition to a saintess, and both professions were practically the same. The man said that the protagonist wasn't one to joke about such things, so she should trust him. Adrian thought he had assigned Eric without much thought, but he didn't think those two would make a bad combination. And since Eric had political talents, he could help her, so it was possible to create a synergy effect between them, saying that he should become a member of the young lady's castle from that day on, and that he would allow his parents to visit her castle at any time. Therefore, Eric should take care of the girl, as it seemed they had gotten close in a short time. Understanding the protagonist, the young man accepted the offer. With that, the protagonist was happy, thinking that he was very excited about the battle to see who would become the new saintess. Sometime later, the protagonist seemed to be in that game from before, defeating a boss and successfully eliminating it. So he was investing his free time to level up, mentioning that it was very frustrating because his pace was extremely slow and there was nothing he could do about it. Thinking that in time, hunting a group of 5 to 10 members was essential, and they were equipped with various items and abilities. But the combination of 2 people and an animal was still helping. However, the real problem wasn't that. He was encountering other players more frequently. Standing up, the protagonist asked to go right away. However, someone called out to the protagonist, mentioning that they had never seen a support like the eagle beside him, asking how he got such an animal. Adrian said it was a wild animal temporarily tamed as assistance, so it wasn't a support. As the girl walked away, Adrian thought that it wasn't the first time he had to explain it that way, questioning what the market capitalization of the online producer in Chronicles was, as he should just buy everything. And that didn't seem like such a bad idea, because if the user base was made up of commoners, there was a high chance of being underestimated, so it could be possible. Meanwhile, the protagonist was defeating bosses, thinking that he wasn't so underestimated, wondering what he should do and if he should perhaps buy slaves and create a workshop. However, that wasn't right, buying slaves being from a democratic country, so he should use his last wish ticket. That way he would have an efficient way to level up without encountering other users, remembering that he had an extremely convenient method without having to buy the entire game if he could monopolize the hunting grounds. Meanwhile, that second prince seemed to be talking to someone, mentioning that he had heard his country would drop the time limit of access to the game. The other girl said it wasn't long ago that even money transactions for items were blocked, so she thought they needed to do some hard work now. However, the other girl said it wouldn't be possible to sell items directly to a country. Irritated, the other woman said she would have to pay the fine 10 times if the people found out. But the girl said that gradually it was becoming difficult to simulate games. Then another woman appeared, mentioning that someone was looking for her, a mage above level 200, but he asked for a meeting with the guild leader because he had an offer to make. However, the girl just asked him to leave, saying it was a cheap trick to get into the guild. The girl said it would be a good idea to meet with the young man because he had bought 10 dragon hearts as a gift. Moreover, he was equipped with the best hybrid equipment that could be used at level 200, and considering the abilities of the equipment, she thought it was better than what higher level users had. Sometime later, the protagonist was in the guild hall, introducing himself with a false name, Mingy. Observing the protagonist, the girl thought he was quite peculiar, and indeed, everything he had was extremely expensive. Mentioning that the young man had talked about a deal, she questioned what had brought him to that place. He responded that he wanted to rent hunting grounds that the Black Dragon Guild was monopolizing, and he wanted to prevent other users from accessing the hunting grounds, questioning how it was being done now in the Black Dragon Guild. Surprised, the woman thought she had never seen anything like that before. Additionally, he wanted the guild to manage it, asking how much they could use the hunting grounds. Adrian said he would pay if he could rent them, offering 5 times the total profit they could make from that ground. The woman then asked which hunting ground he wanted to monopolize. He quickly responded that it was the Katlern Chemra dungeon, leaving the woman surprised by what she had heard. Because more than 200 people use that dungeon every day, and of course it was very profitable. But low-level people went to that hunting ground, and if each person earned at least 50,000 in loot from that place, the total profits per day would be over 10 million. However, for Adrian, that wasn't a problem. But in exchange, he wanted her to prevent other users from entering that place. The girl asked if there was some special item in that place or if it was related to a hidden mission. And the boy responded that he just wanted to level up. Besides, he was leveling up alone but wanted to enjoy the game without anyone in his way. And if she wanted, he could pay in advance, so they could even negotiate with online currency. Then the girl questioned how long he wanted to rent that dungeon, and Adrian replied that for now, he would like to rent it for about a month. Moreover, he would continue if he could level up peacefully. However, if he saw that it was taking too long to level up, he would rent another hunting ground. Still, he would keep renting until he reached the maximum level, leaving the woman completely surprised by the amount of money that would be received, quickly ordering her subordinates to bring something for them to drink. Shortly after, the group seemed to be resting after having the offer accepted. Opening the account, the girl asked if the amount had been transferred, and she was completely pleased because the digits were correct, and the total amount would be 350 million for just 1 week. Outside the location, the woman was informed that the protagonist had said he wanted to use the ground immediately, so they should hurry and send a message to the guild members to clear the dungeon. Sometime later, the protagonist was already inside the dungeon, mentioning that the speed was very impressive for leveling up, because he was on a completely different level. And Arshia observed that the experience acquisition speed had doubled compared to before because he had reached level 220 in just a single month. So it seemed that he would reach level 250 faster than expected. Sometime later, Adrian was already out of the game, with Perseus saying that he had been informed that the competition would be held in the Holy Land sooner than expected, leaving the protagonist completely confused by what he had heard, thinking that this happened just when he thought he could level up continuously for some time. So the competition for Saint and Saintess was being anticipated earlier than planned, mentioning that he had heard that if everything went as planned, it would happen in the second half of next year. But they were looking for a candidate and intended to finish it within a month. So he thought he could level up without interruption for the next few days, but even though it was repetitive, the situation wasn't bad. Because as the competition advanced faster, the number of rival candidates would also decrease little by little. Therefore, what they needed to do was create a winning strategy for the girl to stand out and have no worries. And first, they should turn her into a Saintess candidate representing the Kingdom of Reinhardt. 2 weeks ago, a donation was sent in the girl's name to the Archbishopric of the Kingdom of Reinhardt, and the next day, an archbishop from the Kingdom of Reinhardt would visit her territory. So the protagonist, along with the girl, would go to greet them. Perseus asked if he was planning to attract the Archbishop of the Kingdom first, and the protagonist confirmed that was exactly the plan. Moreover, if they managed to attract him, they might lose reinforcements to the royal family. Perseus questioned whether this girl would cooperate with the plan, and the protagonist said that she had someone who frequently motivated her by her side, so everything would be fine. The man mentioned that since it was Adrian saying this, it would probably work, handing over the materials that the young man had requested earlier. Surprised, Adrian mentioned that Perseus had understood very well, and Perseus said that among the candidates participating in the Sanctus competition, these 3 were the most promising. One of them was an apparently 210-year-old elf girl, another was the 3rd daughter of the Duchy of Evelyn from the Beringum Empire, and lastly, there was a 19-year-old citizen girl from Evero. Surprised, Adrian said that they certainly drew a lot of attention, and even without their sponsors, they were more remarkable than his girl. And to be honest, at the moment when there was a list of candidates, he definitely wanted to shout that he was giving up. However, he had expected that rivals like this would appear one day, so there was no reason to be so frustrated. Mentioning that it wouldn't be an easy task, but even so, it wasn't impossible, because he believed in the potential his friend had, and he couldn't give up the title of the sponsor who created his Saintess. So time passed, and Adrian said that his work for that day was done, so it was time to play a little. Perseus, before that, asked if he could ask a question, inquiring how much he had donated to the Archbishopric, because as far as he knew about the Archbishop of the Kingdom of Reinhardt, he wasn't a man who would move just because of money. In response, Adrian just smiled, saying he had paid a total of $10 trillion. Meanwhile, in a room, a man was surprised because the protagonist, the sponsor of that girl, had made a giant donation of 10 trillion, leaving the girl completely interested in the protagonist for the power he had. Sometime later, the Archbishop had already arrived at the protagonist's house, saying that it was wonderful, because he was already able to use divine magic in that way. So the old man believed that the girl could truly become a real saintess. Pleased, the protagonist thought that they had indeed managed to bring the Archbishop to their side, mentioning that there was something he would like to discuss with the man. because that woman had previously suggested forming an alliance during the competition. And to be more precise, it was a request from her sponsor, rather than a suggestion from herself. The Archbishop said that Lady Asteria was a good candidate, and he thought the suggestion was worth considering, but first, it would be better to increase the possibility of the girl being selected and then compete with the girl afterward. But it seemed that the Duchy of Riverdite had no desire to confront the Marquis, a very competitive emperor. Sometime later, the second prince said that there was no reason to refuse that because if a saintess were born in their country, the national status would increase exponentially, so he would have to have a good conversation with his father. Adrian thought that, as expected, he didn't refuse his request because he couldn't let their relationship become more strained than it already was. The second prince, in turn, asked if Adrian had already heard the latest news, as the daughter of Marcus Otis and Count Acris had disappeared out of nowhere, and because of that, the crown prince's side had been turned upside down. Adrian thought that if he was talking about the daughter of the Marquis, he must have been referring to Michelle, so he thought that she would certainly be on the crown prince's side. Surprised, the second prince mentioned that it seemed the news hadn't reached the protagonist, but that was understandable, as he himself had only received it about an hour ago. Adrian, in turn, seemed pleased, mentioning that it was very good news. However, that wasn't the protagonist's true expression, thinking that these things were happening right when the Saintess competition was about to take place, questioning what the meaning of all this was. Sometime later, the protagonist was talking with the other prince, mentioning that judging by his expression, it seemed the other prince had already told him about the current situation. Marcus Otis and Count Cress were cousins from the same maternal family, so the two were like brothers, very close. Moreover, Count Acris was very fond of Miss Michelle, as if she were his own daughter, so he volunteered to be her personal bodyguard when he heard she was going on vacation alone. Adrian questioned whether the Aura Master really needed to be a guard, so the problem must have occurred during the journey to the destination. However, the problem wasn't the destination of her trip, as it was a place where tensions were very high with the Brigham Empire, where a war could break out any moment. Besides, he didn't know if Adrian was aware of that. Miss Michelle, along with Otis, was a great fan of Archduke Lucas, so it seemed that she was seriously committed to finding his destiny. However, she had already heard that the destiny was discovered in the Republic of Prius. Thus, she couldn't recognize this fact and impulsively planned a vacation to try to find the true one. Observing the situation, Adrian asked if it was really his fault, because it was because of him that all this had happened. Meanwhile, Arcia was eating somewhere, thinking that Adrian should return soon. Back with Adrian, the young man said that he would go to that place, because maybe he was the most suitable person to rescue those two. So he would move secretly, while hiding his identity. Hearing what the protagonist had said, the first prince was surprised, stating that he would send the location of the last place they were spotted, thus narrowing down the places where they could be on his terminal. Therefore, he would leave the two in Adrian's hands. Meanwhile, Michelle and her father seemed to be fleeing from something, and they were apparently hit by a projectile. Fallen to the ground, several Vanguard soldiers surrounded them, ordering them to surrender. The man said they were just tourists and had no intention of being hostile in their country, mentioning that if they really had bad intentions, they wouldn't be walking around with a girl by their side. However, the man asked what misunderstanding was happening because from the moment that woman approached, the verdict of their sentence had already been completely decided. Whispering in the girl's ear, the man seemed to be planning something, telling her that when he gave the order, she should run backward without looking at them so she would be able to use her teleportation. And meanwhile, he would buy time for her to successfully escape. He ordered the girl to go at once, and with tears in her eyes, she began to run away from that place. When the Vanguard soldiers tried to go after her, the other man blocked them so the girl could leave, saying they would only get her over his dead body. Quickly, one of the men advanced towards the poor man. However, something ended up hitting that soldier. Looking back, the man seemed surprised by something because above there was a floating fortress using invisibility magic. Inside it, Adrian said that he had provided the cause of all of this, but logically speaking, it might make sense to reach the Republic of Prius with things in this state. Then Arcia said that their target had been discovered, and the protagonist said that things would be resolved more easily and quickly than he had expected. Quickly using his teleportation magic shortly after, Adrian seemed to be observing something below, because meanwhile several people were protecting that man from before from some monsters. Arcia, in turn, asked what the protagonist wanted to do. He responded that they would join that cause. Quickly, it began descending towards that place, seemingly using some kind of ability, unleashing a burst of fire on that area. Arcia, in turn, delivered several slashes to the Vanguard men. Talking to the man, the protagonist mentioned that they had arrived at that place to talk to them, asking everyone to return, using a healing spell on the two of them. Observing Adrian, Michelle seemed to realize something, quickly asking to return home with her uncle. Seeing that situation, the protagonist thought he was pleased because the commotion was being resolved in a very easy way. However, the Vanguard man seemed to block those too, saying that before that, he had something to ask the woman, mentioning that the girl had accessed the meeting with Louis Farmount, asking if that meeting was genuine. Michelle said that judging by its form, it was quite plausible, but if one took a quick look, the contents were much more inadequate than expected. The man mentioned that there was a small chance it was real, but even so, it still wasn't. So the commander thought that it was indeed a fake meeting created by the person who had truly discovered it. Observing the situation, Adrian wondered if by any chance he should kill them all. However, at that very moment, he changed his mind, thinking that he was doing this without knowing how big the revolutionary army was. However, no one knew that he was the one who had discovered that legacy, so he should keep his mouth shut until the right moment came. Continuing to speak, the man asked how she'd approached that meeting and if she shouldn't have invaded the president's palace. However, the girl unexpectedly responded that she had approached it online, so she thought the meeting was hidden in a virtual world and therefore wasn't in the real world. Furthermore, when she accessed the terminal, she was able to confirm that he had frequently accessed a certain domain. Observing the woman, Adrian thinks that, as expected, she wasn't an ordinary woman and that someone like her was able to investigate very deeply. And if he hadn't discovered it earlier, that girl would definitely have been the owner of the legacy. Impressed with the girl's abilities, Adrian mentions that he had a tool he had obtained from someone he knew. Additionally, the pursuit team would arrive quickly, and for that reason, they should leave that place quickly. And they also needed to escort those two. However, the man says that he hadn't finished doing that yet, because his commander had called those two people to his meeting. Sometime later, the entire group seems to be teleported to a completely unknown place. While a man walked, several Vanguard people surrounded them. Surprised, Adrian thinks that all those people around him, without exception, were Aura Masters. That man says he was a citizen of Prius, but it was also his first time going to the Northern Glacier. So he was curious because they had said that the aurora of the Northern Glacier was rainbow-colored, mentioning that it was a pleasure to meet that girl along with her uncle. Michelle, in turn, thanks the man for saving her and says she would never forget his kindness. Surprised, the man says he was meeting someone who was recently the center of attention, because she was in front of Marcus Adrian Lawrence along with Countess Arcia. So the video ends here. If you don't want to miss the next part, activate the notification bell and see you next time on Tov's channel.